Welcome back. Tonight we quietly wander through the darkest corners of WWII, where survival took on new meaning and resilience became the only currency. Imagine for a moment the suffocating atmosphere of a refugee camp during the war. Narrow streets filled with anxiety where the shadows of Nazi soldiers loomed. You might feel a shiver run down your spine thinking of the constant fear of being discovered. The clinking of distant boots on gravel, the tightness in your chest, the questions of where to hide and who you could trust. You probably won't survive this, but your strength will be the lesson tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to hear from you, so post your location and local time in the comments. I am curious about where in the world you're joining me from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in history, not only for the atrocities that occurred, but also for the story of survival that was often forged in the most brutal of circumstances. During World War II, millions of Jewish refugees were forced to flee their homes, their countries, their identities, all in the hope of finding safety. But the refuge they sought often meant a life in overcrowded camps, shrouded in fear, uncertainty, and deprivation. These camps weren't just places of shelter, they were survival zones. Every day was a battle not just against hunger or disease, but against the fear of discovery by the Nazis who relentlessly hunted down those who had managed to escape. You walk among them now in the cramped spaces of these camps where hope was a scarce commodity and every morning was uncertain. The air is thick with the tension of a community desperately trying to hold on to their dignity, their identity, and whatever small scraps of hope they could find. You see families clustering together, speaking in hushed voices, holding onto the last bits of normalcy in a world gone mad. Historians still argue whether these camps were primarily spaces of refuge or entrapment. Were they the last flicker of hope for a community being hunted down, or were they just another prison one where the borders of safety were razor thin and survival often meant betrayal? The experiences within these camps were shaped by both resilience and tragedy, a paradox that made them uniquely painful places to exist. Tonight we'll walk with those who lived through it, sharing their stories of how they coped with life in the camps while constantly trying to avoid detection. From the exhaustion of constant movement to the quiet, tense moments when escape seemed like the only answer, we'll explore how Jewish refugees, despite the odds, built their lives in the shadows. The journey to the camps was long and treacherous. For many Jewish refugees, it started with a desperate flight from the encroaching Nazi forces, escaping to places that promised refuge. But the promise of safety was a fragile one. Fleeing their homes, families, and histories, these refugees became shadows constantly moving and hiding, uncertain of their next step. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds even more so. They had no choice but to continue. The world they once knew had become unrecognizable, and the journey itself was fraught with danger at every turn. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a Jewish family having to leave everything behind: your home, your job, your belongings, even your loved ones. The noise of bombings and the looming threat of the Nazis left you with no choice but to flee to foreign lands. Each day, the fear of being caught weighed heavy. Refugees used whatever means of transportation they could, trains, trucks, or even on foot, to escape the growing grip of Nazi persecution. If they were lucky, they could make it to neighboring countries or unofficial border crossings, often with only a vague understanding of what awaited them on the other side. It wasn't just the physical journey that was grueling, it was also the psychological toll. For the refugees, leaving their homeland meant the loss of their identity, their culture, and their sense of home. They had to constantly hide their true identities. Papers were forged, languages were carefully avoided, and every conversation carried the threat of revealing their Jewish background. Historians argue whether the constant movement from one refugee camp to another helped or hindered survival. On one hand, it spread the refugees out, making it more difficult for the Nazis to track them. On the other hand, it meant that the journey to safety was often uncertain and dangerous, with many caught before reaching the safety of the camps. One of the first stops for many of these refugees was the makeshift camps, usually located on the outskirts of larger cities or hidden away in neutral territories. These were not places of refuge in the way most people would imagine. Often they were overcrowded with limited access to food, water, and medical care. Refugees shared cramped, unsanitary conditions, constantly worried about the next attack or raid. It was here that Jewish refugees began the process of adjusting to life in a camp, forming the first communities among people who had been displaced from everything familiar. While some camps were set up to offer temporary shelter and protection, many refugees soon learned that these places were nothing more than waiting rooms, waiting for the war to end, waiting for a passport, or more tragically, waiting for a future that might never come. The worst of the conditions came when refugees arrived in camps run by Nazi collaborators or where the Nazis themselves had a strong presence. In these situations, there was no safety, only the constant threat of betrayal or capture. Historians still argue about how much the journey to these camps, this escape, actually led to the survival of many. Some say it was the mere act of being outside Nazi-occupied zones that provided the chance to survive. Others argue that the perilous conditions made escape even more challenging, with death, disease, or worse constantly on the horizon. You can almost hear the sound of hurried footsteps, the distant crackle of radios in foreign languages, and the rustle of papers and coats as refugees pass from one border to another. At each checkpoint, the reality sets in. It doesn't matter how far you go, how fast you run every day is a gamble. But somehow, you keep moving, hoping that just beyond the horizon lies a better tomorrow. And for some, these first steps away from Nazi persecution marked the beginning of their survival story. The act of fleeing persecution was often the only thing that kept people going. It was not an escape to freedom, but an escape from death. And for those who did reach the camps, it was the beginning of a long, uncertain fight for survival, where the very act of existing became an act of defiance against the oppressive forces chasing them. Their strength was born from the unyielding desire to stay alive, to preserve their humanity, and above all, to hold on to the hope that they might one day return to a world that no longer existed. Arriving in the camps was not a sudden relief. Rather, it marked the beginning of another chapter of suffering, one in which survival was an everyday struggle. The first days, often weeks, were filled with confusion, fear, and uncertainty. For those fleeing Nazi persecution, the camp was supposed to be a place of refuge, but instead it quickly became a reminder of the ongoing terror they had left behind. The air was heavy with the reality that while they were no longer being hunted down by the Nazis, their lives were still fragile and the dangers they faced were far from over. The camps themselves, whether in neutral countries or those under Nazi influence, were overcrowded and inadequately supplied. Barracks that were meant to house far fewer people were packed to the brim, often with families who had lost everything but each other. Refugees huddled together in tight spaces, unable to find much privacy or rest. The beds, if they existed, were crude and uncomfortable, rough straw mattresses on wooden frames frequently shared between multiple individuals. The camp environment was a far cry from safety and comfort. It was a chaotic and unclean place with minimal sanitation. Filthy latrines were often the only form of public restroom, and food was a rarity rationed in small amounts that did little to sustain the people who had already endured so much on their journey to escape. The lack of food was a constant concern. Rations were often insufficient, and the quality of the food available was poor. Many refugees were already weakened by malnutrition from their arduous flight from Nazi territories, and the camp's meager provisions did little to restore their strength. Despite these harsh conditions, refugees adapted by sharing whatever they had, creating makeshift kitchens where they could cook what little food they could gather or trade. Community bonds were often strengthened through this shared struggle for sustenance, and food became more than just a necessity. It became a symbol of survival, of community, and sometimes of resistance. The physical conditions in the camps were bad enough, but the psychological toll was equally devastating. Many refugees carried with them the trauma of their past experiences, the death of loved ones, the destruction of their homes, and the horrors they had witnessed. In the camp, this trauma was compounded by the uncertainty of the future. Each day brought with it a new wave of anxiety. When would they be able to leave? Would they ever escape the camp? And if so, where would they go? Many refugees didn't know where to turn for help. They were stuck in a foreign land, often speaking a language they didn't understand, unable to return to their homes and unsure whether they had any future at all. Some refugees dealt with this uncertainty by clinging to small routines, religious practices, quiet moments of personal reflection, or forming small groups of support. However, the overwhelming feeling of being displaced and powerless was hard to overcome. Historians still argue whether this constant anxiety and stress contributed to the mental and physical decline of the refugees. Was the psychological toll more destructive than the physical conditions they faced? Some believe that the trauma experienced in the camps as a result of living in constant uncertainty led to long-lasting psychological scars for many survivors. In addition to these personal struggles, the refugees also had to contend with the ever-present threat of Nazi detection. The goal of the Nazis was clear: to capture and deport anyone who was considered undesirable, including Jewish refugees. The camps, though a temporary haven, were not completely safe. They were often monitored by individuals sympathetic to the Nazi regime, and many refugees feared being handed over to the Nazis if their true identities were discovered. The constant worry about being reported or betrayed made everyday life even more unbearable. Despite this threat, the refugees found ways to evade detection, using clever tactics to protect their identities and avoid suspicion. Some adopted false identities, while others relied on the help of sympathetic locals or other refugees who were familiar with the area. The underground networks of resistance that were formed in some of the camps were vital in helping many refugees escape to safer locations, or providing them with the resources they needed to survive. These underground movements, though risky, were lifelines for those in the camps who still had hope that they could escape the nightmare of war. While the conditions in the camps were undeniably harsh, they also gave rise to remarkable acts of resilience and solidarity. Refugees, despite their desperate situation, managed to find strength in each other, sharing what little they had and looking out for one another. In a place that was designed to break them, the refugees found ways to rebuild their communities, clinging to their identities and cultural practices, even in the face of constant adversity. As historians reflect on these acts of survival, they argue whether the camps were primarily spaces of confinement or crucibles of resilience. Did the conditions break the spirits of the refugees, or did they in fact create an environment in which new forms of resistance and solidarity could emerge? For many refugees, survival in the camp was not just about physical endurance. It was about maintaining hope, preserving a sense of dignity, and finding ways to fight back against the forces that sought to strip them of everything. Despite the grim conditions, the camp was a place where some could rebuild their lives, albeit temporarily. It was a place of waiting, of survival, and for many a place of transformation. As we move deeper into the stories of the Jewish refugees in the camps, let's pause and reflect on something far less tangible yet incredibly profound: the psychological toll of persecution. Life in the camps was not just a battle for survival in the physical sense, but also an emotional and mental endurance test. The weight of losing one's home family and identity was something the refugees carried with them every moment. There was a heavy cost to being displaced, living in the shadows, constantly fearing betrayal and trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy where nothing felt safe or stable. Imagine for a moment the constant undercurrent of anxiety running through you. Each night as you lie on your makeshift cot in the cramped camp, you can hear the hushed conversations of your fellow refugees, all wondering the same thing. How long can we endure this? How long before the Nazis find us again, or worse, someone here betrays us to them? The fear of being caught or deported was an ever-present reality, making it difficult to sleep, let alone find peace. But even in these dire conditions, the human mind has an incredible ability to adapt and cope, often in surprising ways. For many of these refugees, the trauma of what they had lived through wasn't just something they could get over once the war ended. It was something they had to live with every day. The memories of fleeing from their homes, witnessing violence, and losing loved ones stayed with them long after the physical wounds had healed. Historians often debate how these traumatic experiences in the camps shaped the post-war lives of survivors. Was their psychological resilience built in these camps? Or did the trauma weigh so heavily that it left them struggling for years after the war's end? One thing is certain for many: the scars of living in the camps would last long beyond the physical deprivations. The psychological toll wasn't just about the fear of being discovered, it was also about the isolation. In these camps, refugees were surrounded by others who had endured similar horrors, but this did not always create a sense of community. Often it created a sense of collective trauma that could be overwhelming. The emotional energy needed to keep one's hopes up in the face of so many hardships was draining. It was as if each day demanded not only the strength to survive physically, but the will to survive emotionally. Interestingly, despite the profound isolation, many refugees felt they found ways to adapt psychologically. Some refugees turned to rituals to help manage their stress. Others found solace in small acts of rebellion, like quietly practicing Judaism despite the threat it posed. Others clung to their memories of their pre-war lives, telling stories of better days in an attempt to hold on to their identities and preserve some semblance of the lives they once knew. For those who had children with them, there was a relentless focus on keeping the children hopeful and occupied, ensuring that the next generation wouldn't be defined solely by their suffering. In this way, many refugees found ways to cope, creating tiny moments of humanity amid the crushing weight of their daily lives. But for some, the isolation and loss proved too much. The grief of losing family members, the trauma of seeing loved ones taken away by the Nazis, and the ongoing threat of death led to severe mental health struggles. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness ran rampant in the camps. The camps were places where the human spirit could either break or become even stronger, and not everyone had the strength to withstand the psychological toll. One particularly painful reality that many refugees had to confront was the loss of normalcy. Life in the camps was unrecognizable. Every minute of every day was spent thinking about survival. For refugees who had once led productive, thriving lives, adjusting to the camp's harsh conditions meant surrendering to the loss of dignity. Even something as simple as taking a proper bath or having a quiet moment alone became luxuries they could no longer afford. For many refugees, the psychological toll was tied not just to physical deprivation, but to the constant reminder of what had been lost: freedom, comfort, and stability. However, despite the heavy psychological burden, many refugees found ways to endure. Some leaned on their faith, turning to religious practices for solace. Others found hope in community, forming bonds with fellow refugees, creating support networks within the camps. There were also those who resisted their circumstances with small acts of defiance. A small group of refugees might hold a secret prayer service or organize covert meetings, refusing to allow the Nazis to erase their identity. The act of remembering who they were despite the stripping away of everything else became a vital psychological tool for many. Historians still debate the long-term effects of this trauma. Did living through the camps lead to a stronger sense of solidarity and resilience among the Jewish refugees, or did it fragment their sense of identity? Some argue that the trauma created a lasting sense of community, a deep bond among survivors who understood each other's pain. Others suggest that the isolation and fear experienced in the camps led to a fragmentation of trust as refugees had to protect themselves by any means necessary. What we do know is that the emotional cost was staggering, and it was not just the refugees themselves who were affected. Survivors who made it through the camps often faced immense difficulty reintegrating into post-war society. The war had left deep scars not just on the bodies of those who survived, but on their minds as well. The emotional and psychological toll of living through the camps was not something that could be easily erased. It lived on in the memories, the hearts, and the minds of the survivors, echoing long after the war ended. As you lay back tonight, consider the strength it took for these refugees to cope with such unimaginable stress. Every day in the camps was a mental struggle, an emotional endurance test, where survival was not just about food and water, but about holding on to hope even when everything else seemed lost. The courage to keep going despite the overwhelming odds is something we can all draw inspiration from. Strength in the face of despair. The refugees' resilience in the face of trauma would not have been possible without the support of the communities they built within the camps. Despite the overwhelming hardship, one of the key elements that helped these refugees endure was their ability to form strong social bonds with those around them. In a place where survival was a daily struggle, the refugees realized that they weren't alone. They had each other, and that connection, while forged out of necessity, became a powerful source of strength. Even in the most dire of circumstances, they shared resources, food, and moral support, allowing them to hold on to their humanity amidst the horrors surrounding them. When you step into a camp in the midst of WWII, it might feel impossible to imagine how such bonds could form. After all, the conditions were brutal, overcrowded barracks, a lack of food, disease, and a constant fear of the Nazis' reach. Yet, as you look around, you begin to notice the small acts of kindness, the hand extended when someone falls, the shared piece of bread, the comforting words exchanged in a language that few in the camp even understood. Community, it seemed, was built not in large gatherings or grand speeches, but in the quiet, everyday exchanges between individuals who had been thrown together by fate. One of the strongest forms of community that formed in the camps was based on religious practices. For Jewish refugees, the desire to preserve their faith and cultural practices in the face of destruction was paramount. Even though they were far from their homes, they held on to the rituals that had defined their lives before the war. Whether it was lighting Shabbat candles in secret, holding prayer services in hidden corners of the camp, or observing religious holidays with whatever resources they had, these rituals became an anchor in the midst of the chaos. These practices not only kept them connected to their Jewish identity, but they also fostered a sense of solidarity. The refugees knew that despite the atrocities of the outside world, they still had the ability to preserve the traditions that had helped sustain them for centuries. Historians still argue over the role religion played in the survival of these refugees. Some contend that religious rituals were more than just symbolic. They were crucial to maintaining hope and cohesion in the camps. Others suggest that faith could be a double-edged sword while it provided comfort and solidarity. It also made the refugees more vulnerable as it was another identity trait that the Nazis could use to identify and target them. Still, no matter the debate, it is clear that these religious bonds were one of the few things that the refugees could control in a world that had stripped them of everything else. In addition to religious practices, refugees also found strength in their own personal connections and the bonds they forged with fellow camp residents. They formed informal support networks, helping one another with practical needs, whether it was finding a place to hide, exchanging information, or simply offering emotional support. In a camp where betrayal was a constant fear, these relationships often served as a lifeline. Historians have pointed out that while these bonds were essential for survival, they were also fraught with tension. With limited resources, it was inevitable that jealousy, rivalry, and mistrust would sometimes arise. And yet, despite these challenges, many refugees managed to maintain their humanity, showing remarkable selflessness and empathy even under the harshest conditions. Among the most inspiring aspects of these communities was the role of women. In a time when traditional gender roles were often shattered, women in the camps demonstrated incredible strength and resourcefulness. They not only had to cope with the same physical deprivations as their male counterparts, but they were also responsible for keeping families together, ensuring the survival of their children, and helping to organize these informal support networks. In many cases, women acted as the glue holding the community together, finding ways to adapt to the harsh realities of camp life while also taking on roles that helped to organize the refugees' efforts to survive. Their resilience, despite being so often overlooked in the broader narrative of WWII, was a crucial part of how these communities managed to endure. At times, these small acts of cooperation and solidarity seemed to defy the overwhelming odds. The refugees knew that they were living on borrowed time, that the Nazis could descend upon their camps at any moment. But for many, the need to maintain their human connections, whether through shared meals, whispered conversations, or a small moment of joy amidst the horror, was a way to resist the dehumanizing forces surrounding them. It was these moments that helped to restore a sense of normalcy, even in the most brutal circumstances. What's often overlooked in discussions about the camps is how crucial the spirit of cooperation was to their survival. Whether through religious observance, personal bonds, or mutual support, refugees found ways to live, not just survive, by connecting with others. It was a kind of quiet rebellion, one that defied the Nazis' attempt to break their spirits and identities. Historians still argue whether this sense of community could have been formed without the extreme pressures of the camps. Was the community born out of necessity, or did it reflect a deeper innate need for solidarity that was a fundamental part of the refugee experience? Whatever the case may be, what is certain is that the strength these communities provided helped many endure the unimaginable. For those who made it out of the camps, the memories of these bonds would become a key part of their post-war identity. And for those who did not survive the small acts of kindness and solidarity, in the face of unimaginable adversity, served as a testament to the human spirit's incredible ability to find light in even the darkest of times. As you reflect on this tonight, consider how the refugees, amidst all the horrors, managed to build something beautiful, a network of human connection. In their darkest hour, they found ways to give each other hope. And perhaps in that we can find some inspiration for our own lives today. As we continue, let's turn our focus to one of the most resourceful and desperate forms of survival used by Jewish refugees in this camp, smuggling and evading Nazi detection. The constant threat of discovery and the horrors of deportation hung over them every day. The refugee camps, while offering a temporary reprieve from the direct violence of the Nazis, were also places where the struggle for survival could be as dangerous as the external threat itself. Even in what should have been a safe haven, refugees had to use all their wit, courage, and ingenuity to evade capture. Imagine yourself in the camp where every face could be a betrayer. Every whisper could bring the Nazis to your door. Despite the oppressive surveillance and the looming threat of betrayal, the refugees devised clever ways to hide their identities and escape the confines of the camps. They used false documents, forged papers, and adopted new names to blend in with other displaced persons. The underground movements of resistance, both Jewish and non-Jewish, played a critical role in helping refugees escape the camp's borders and reach safer locations. One of the most common smuggling tactics was to hide Jewish refugees within non-Jewish groups, or to disguise them as local residents. People used anything they could: old clothes disguises, or even pretending to be from a different ethnic group, to pass unnoticed through the watchful eyes of camp authorities. Smugglers would often work in secret, slipping between the lines of Nazi patrols, finding routes that led beyond the camp's reach. But these escapes were risky. The refugees had to rely on their wits and the help of these willing to risk everything for their freedom. For every success story, there were countless failures: refugees caught in the act, deported, or even executed. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these smuggling operations and underground movements. Were they widespread enough to make a significant impact? Or were they just a few desperate attempts that ended in failure? While it's clear that some refugees managed to escape the horrors of Nazi capture through these means, others weren't so fortunate. And yet, the very existence of these networks of escape and resistance highlighted an underlying truth. The human drive for survival can lead to extraordinary acts of courage. Even in the darkest times, there were those who risked everything to fight back, even if only in small, seemingly insignificant ways. The existence of these underground networks is still a source of intrigue. How did they form? Who were the key players, and how did they manage to stay secret? Some argue that the secrecy of these operations was key to their success. The less anyone knew, the fewer the chances of betrayal. The covert nature of the resistance helped ensure its survival, but it also meant that many of the stories of these operations remain untold, buried in the folds of history. The constant stress of evading the Nazis affected not just the refugees' physical health, but also their mental well-being. The paranoia, the fear of being betrayed, and the constant tension took a psychological toll that survivors often carried with them long after the war ended. They lived with the knowledge that their escape, their survival, was not just an accident. It was a series of choices and actions, both risky and calculated, that had shaped their existence. They weren't simply fleeing, they were constantly fighting for their survival, often without a clear end in sight. The refugees were in a continuous state of alertness, never fully able to relax, always looking over their shoulders. Historians still debate how effective the smuggling networks were in saving lives. Some argue that these underground efforts were critical in sparing thousands of lives, while others suggest that they were far less widespread than often assumed. However, the very fact that they existed speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. It shows that even in the most desperate circumstances, there were people who were willing to risk everything for the chance to survive, to resist, and to fight back in whatever way they could. Now think about it. The refugees who managed to escape were the lucky few. The ones who got past Nazi soldiers, the ones who made it through the underground networks, or those who somehow found a way to slip through the cracks. They became the survivors, the ones whose stories would later be told. And yet, for every one of them, there were countless others who did not make it out, whose names were lost to the ravages of history. The escape stories we hear today are often the exception, not the rule. As you reflect on these efforts to survive, think about the extraordinary courage it took for those in the camps to find ways to resist. The constant anxiety of knowing that survival wasn't guaranteed, and that every decision could be the difference between life and death, shaped these refugees in ways few of us can fully comprehend. But through their actions, their resourcefulness, and their refusal to give up, they showed the world the lengths to which the human spirit can go to preserve life, even in the face of unimaginable danger. As we move deeper into the lives of the Jewish refugees during WWII, we arrive at one of the most pivotal aspects of their survival underground networks. While smuggling was often the immediate form of escape, these networks created a broader lifeline that could transport people from one place of refuge to another, protect them from Nazi detection, and offer the hope of a future beyond the camps. The underground resistance movements were often the only thing standing between the refugees and capture, and they existed not just in the physical world, but also as a sort of invisible thread of solidarity that ran through the camps and surrounding areas. Picture it. The refugee desperate and frightened, looking around, wondering who could be trusted. The whispers of resistance were often quiet, passed from person to person, sometimes between strangers in the dark, sometimes in the form of a piece of paper, a code, or a brief but meaningful glance. The fear of betrayal was ever present. Every step outside of the camp could lead to discovery, every encounter with a stranger potentially dangerous. But in these moments of desperation, a network existed that allowed the refugees to escape the nightmare of Nazi rule. This underground web didn't just offer physical refuge, it also represented the belief in resistance, in defiance against oppression, in the idea that even the smallest actions could make a difference. Historians still debate the extent and effectiveness of these networks. Were they widespread enough to be significant, or were they the efforts of a small, determined group working against overwhelming odds? Some argue that these underground operations played a critical role in saving thousands of lives, while others suggest that they were more isolated with limited reach in comparison to the vast number of refugees who faced impossible odds. Regardless of their size, however, these networks offered an invaluable opportunity for escape and survival. They connected the refugees to the larger web of resistance movements across Europe, linking them to those willing to risk their own lives for the chance to help, even when the Nazis' eyes were everywhere. The underground networks varied greatly depending on the region and the level of Nazi occupation. In countries like France, where the Vichy government collaborated with the Nazis, resistance movements were often more active, organizing escapes, distributing false papers, and hiding refugees in plain sight. These networks relied on the courage and resourcefulness of individuals who were often just ordinary people, farmers, workers, teachers, priests who risked everything to protect the persecuted. In some cases, these networks involved large organized groups with military-like precision. In others, they were loose associations of individuals who simply helped where they could, in small ways that collectively made a significant difference. Imagine for a moment being a part of this underground resistance, helping refugees cross borders, providing them with food money and safe passage. You would have to act with care, moving quickly, avoiding suspicion, and never letting your guard down. You might be one of the few people who knew the way to a secret safe house, or perhaps you were the person who forged a passport or identity card, allowing someone to pass as a local. The risk was immense. If caught, the consequences could be death, not just for you, but for everyone you helped. And yet these resistance movements existed thriving in the shadows, fighting a war that was often invisible but just as fierce as the battles on the front lines. The role of non-Jewish allies in these underground movements cannot be overstated. Many of the people who aided Jewish refugees were not Jewish themselves. They were motivated by a sense of moral duty, by the belief in human rights, and by their own form of resistance to the Nazi regime. Some were members of the French resistance, others were simply concerned civilians who could not stand idly by. Their efforts were a form of quiet defiance, a refusal to accept the brutal persecution that the Nazis were carrying out. These individuals, sometimes working alone and sometimes as part of larger organized groups, were essential to the survival of thousands of Jewish refugees. But the success of these underground networks was not just dependent on their ability to hide refugees or smuggle them across borders. It was also about the solidarity they inspired. The refugees themselves often became active participants in these networks, helping one another, passing on information, and creating a sense of community in the midst of the devastation. It was within these small but vital networks of support that the refugees found their greatest strength. They helped each other not just to survive, but to maintain their dignity in the face of horror. While the underground resistance was critical, it also carried with it a tragic undertone. The risk of discovery was never far away. In some cases, the very individuals who helped refugees were caught, tortured, and killed. The Nazis were relentless in their pursuit of Jews, and anyone caught aiding them could face severe punishment. For every successful escape, there were likely many more instances where people were betrayed, where the cost of helping refugees became too high for some to bear. Betrayal was an ever-present danger, and the refugees knew that their survival often depended on the willingness of others to take incredible risks on their behalf. Some managed to escape, but many did not. The specter of betrayal, of being sold out to the Nazis, hovered over every interaction. As you reflect on the importance of these underground networks tonight, think about the tremendous courage it took for both the refugees and their rescuers. In a world where fear and despair reigned, there were those who, against all odds, found ways to resist. These underground movements, operating in secrecy and at great personal cost, represented the power of solidarity and resistance. They reminded the refugees that they were not alone, that there were still people willing to fight back against the darkness that sought to swallow them whole. As the refugee camps grew more entrenched in their harsh realities, the question of identity became increasingly important. For Jewish refugees, maintaining a sense of self, an identity not defined by persecution, became a form of resistance. The constant threat of Nazi detection, the overwhelming fear of betrayal, and the daily struggle to survive all contributed to an identity crisis. Yet amidst the dehumanizing conditions, refugees fought to retain their Jewish identity, to preserve their culture, and to hold on to the smallest piece of normalcy. In the camp, you see the weary faces of refugees who, despite everything, still find ways to cling to their sense of who they are. They gather for secret prayer services, hold quiet celebrations of Jewish holidays, and try to maintain the customs that had been part of their lives before the war. For many, these small acts of cultural preservation were not just a means of survival, they were a declaration that they would not allow the Nazis to erase their identity. Even in the most dire circumstances, the refugees demonstrated that they were more than just victims. They were people with a history, with a culture, and with a future. Historians argue over the role of religion in the lives of Jewish refugees during WWII. Some believe that religious practice became a form of spiritual resistance, a way of fighting back against the Nazi attempt to obliterate Jewish identity. Others argue that for some refugees, religion became a survival mechanism, a comforting routine that provided a sense of stability in a world turned upside down. Regardless of the interpretation, it's clear that the practice of religion in the camps served as a powerful means of emotional and psychological resilience. The refugees who managed to hold on to their faith, despite the hardships they faced, found ways to preserve not just their Jewish identity, but also their hope for the future. In addition to religious observance, refugees also found ways to preserve their cultural practices. Music, art, and literature, forms of self-expression that had been crucial to Jewish identity for centuries, became lifelines in the camps. In the bleakest of circumstances, the refugees organized clandestine performances of plays, created makeshift libraries, and composed songs of hope and defiance. These acts of cultural preservation were not just ways of keeping occupied, they were a way of affirming their humanity in a place designed to strip them of it. For many, these cultural activities became acts of resistance in themselves, challenging the Nazis' efforts to dehumanize them, and reinforcing their right to exist, to express themselves, and to celebrate their heritage. In some camps, underground schools were set up where children could learn about their heritage, about Jewish history, and even about the outside world that had been so violently shut off from them. Refugees understood that while survival was crucial, the preservation of knowledge and culture was just as important. For those who had lost everything, these small acts of education were vital for maintaining a sense of purpose. They knew that they were not just preserving their cultural identity for themselves, but for future generations. The camps, as oppressive as they were, could not erase the generations of Jewish learning art and tradition that had preceded them. These educational efforts, though small, represented a refusal to let the Nazis succeed in their goal of erasing Jewish culture from the world. Despite these acts of cultural and spiritual resistance, the refugees in the camps also faced moments of deep disillusionment. The reality of their situation, the overcrowding, the hunger, the diseases, was often overwhelming. The constant fear of being betrayed or discovered weighed heavily on everyone. The emotional toll of living in such conditions, knowing that escape was often impossible, created a sense of hopelessness for many. The psychological scars of living in constant fear were not easily healed, and for some refugees, the question of identity became too much to bear. How could they maintain their sense of self when everything that had once defined them, home, family, community, was being stripped away? But even in these darkest moments, the act of survival became a form of resistance. The very fact that the refugees continued to live, continued to fight for their identity, was a testament to their strength. They knew that the Nazis sought not just to kill their bodies, but to erase their very existence, to wipe out their culture and history. By continuing to practice their faith, by telling stories, by gathering in secret, and by preserving their traditions, the refugees stood defiant. They weren't just hiding from the Nazis, they were resisting the attempt to erase them from history. Historians continue to debate whether the psychological cost of life in the camps was more destructive than the physical hardships. Some argue that the emotional toll was so great that it left lasting scars on the survivors, making it difficult for them to reintegrate into society after the war. Others suggest that the resilience shown by the refugees in maintaining their identity and culture played a crucial role in their long-term survival and healing. What is clear, however, is that the struggle for identity was one of the most significant battles that refugees fought during their time in the camps. As you lie back tonight, think about the strength it took for these refugees to hold on to who they were in the face of such overwhelming odds. Their ability to preserve their identity, even in the darkest hours, speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything they lost, they refused to let go of their heritage, their faith, and their history. The camp may have been a place of suffering, but it was also a place where identity was fiercely protected, even against the forces of destruction. As we continue, let's shift our focus to the everyday survival strategies that Jewish refugees had to develop in the camps. While the emotional and psychological resilience they demonstrated in maintaining their identity was crucial, it was the sheer practicality of survival, the day-to-day ingenuity that often made the difference between life and death. From the moment they arrived, refugees faced a daunting reality: food was scarce. Shelter was minimal, and the camp authorities were often indifferent at best or hostile at worst. Every small resource became a precious commodity, and refugees had to rely on their resourcefulness, creativity, and sheer determination to endure. Picture yourself stepping into a crowded makeshift camp barracks filled with refugees, a mix of exhaustion and quiet determination in the air. You quickly realize that the battle for survival doesn't stop once you find a place to sleep. It's about making sure you have enough food to last the day, ensuring you stay healthy in the face of disease, and navigating a system that is far from designed to help you. One of the first things you notice is the scarcity of food. The rations are meager, often not enough to satisfy a person's hunger, and the quality is poor. The daily struggle for sustenance becomes one of the most critical elements of life in the camps. Refugees had to find ways to stretch their rations or supplement them with anything they could find, sometimes scavenging for scraps or trading whatever items they had for food. This constant search for food led to a surprising degree of resourcefulness. In some camps, refugees would work together to grow small gardens, planting vegetables in any available space, even in the harshest conditions. Others relied on makeshift kitchens where they could cook what little they could gather or exchange. Even the smallest scraps of food became vital, and refugees learned to make the most out of what they had. They became creative, turning simple ingredients into meals that provided just enough nourishment to get through the day. Food, it seemed, was not just about survival, it became a symbol of their resilience, a reminder that they could still find ways to live despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. But survival in the camp wasn't just about food, it was also about staying healthy. In an environment where disease was rampant, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited access to medical care, the risk of disease was ever present. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread quickly, fueled by the poor conditions. Refugees had to adapt to these challenges, often relying on one another for support. While doctors and medical supplies were scarce, camp communities would sometimes band together to create makeshift medical stations, with those who had some experience in healthcare offering what little help they could. However, the threat of disease was constant, and the refugees knew that the smallest injury or illness could quickly become fatal. In the face of these challenges, the refugees also had to learn how to navigate the social and political dynamics of life in the camp. They had to understand who to trust and who to avoid, all while maintaining the precarious balance of staying under the radar of the camp authorities. In some camps, there were camp police, other refugees who were given limited power by the camp authorities, and who were tasked with keeping order. While some of these individuals helped maintain a semblance of safety, others took advantage of their position, exploiting their fellow refugees. This power dynamic created a complex web of relationships where loyalty, trust, and survival were constantly in flux. Every day was a balancing act between surviving the external forces of the Nazis and dealing with the internal politics of the camp. Yet despite these difficulties, the refugees found ways to keep moving forward. They made friends, formed small communities of solidarity, and did their best to maintain hope. Some refugees kept diaries or wrote letters, even though they knew these writings might never reach their destination. The act of documenting their lives became a form of resistance, a way of asserting that their lives mattered, even if the outside world didn't care. Others told stories to pass the time, stories of better days or of life before the war. The act of storytelling became a powerful tool for emotional survival, allowing the refugees to hold onto memories of a world that no longer existed. Historians still argue about how much of the survival of these refugees was due to their mental resilience versus their practical survival skills. Some believe that the ability to maintain hope was the primary factor in their survival, while others argue that it was their ability to adapt physically and practically to the harsh conditions that kept them alive. What is clear, however, is that these refugees had to develop a unique set of survival skills that went beyond just the physical act of staying alive. They had to outsmart their surroundings, create new ways to obtain what they needed, and rely on their own ingenuity to survive. In many ways, the very act of surviving became an act of defiance against the forces that sought to destroy them. You can imagine the quiet moments of triumph when a small group of refugees manages to organize a successful barter for food, or when they manage to sneak past Nazi patrols undetected. These small victories, though fleeting, were powerful reminders that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could be found. The survivors in the camps understood that life wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining a sense of self, of dignity, and of community, even in the most oppressive conditions. These small acts of resistance, these moments of ingenuity, were the threads that held them together and helped them endure the unbearable. As you reflect on this, think about how you might have adapted to such circumstances. The mental and physical strength required to survive in those conditions was beyond anything most of us will ever experience. Yet in these camps, the refugees showed the world that survival wasn't just about enduring the hardships. It was about finding the strength to maintain your humanity, your identity, and your hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. Despite the dire conditions, one of the most powerful forms of resistance within the refugee camps was the role played by non-Jewish allies. These individuals, often risking their own safety, helped Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution and provided critical support in countless ways. Some were part of organized underground movements, others were simply ordinary people who, guided by a strong sense of moral duty, found ways to help. These non-Jewish allies became lifelines for many, offering food-safe passage and, most importantly, hope when it seemed like all was lost. Imagine walking through the camp feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders when suddenly a stranger approaches. At first you're wary, who can you trust in a place like this? But this person who doesn't share your background speaks to you softly, promising safety and a way out. This is a risk both for them and for you, but you can't help but listen. These acts of bravery were more common than we often realize. Non-Jewish men and women, often from occupied or neutral countries, put their lives on the line to help Jewish refugees. Many of them worked secretly to smuggle people out of the camps, forge documents, or hide families in their homes. Historians still debate the extent to which these non-Jewish rescuers played a role in the overall survival of Jewish refugees during the war. Some argue that these networks were essential to saving countless lives, while others suggest that their impact, though valuable, was more limited in scope. What is clear, however, is that these individuals, whether members of resistance movements or just ordinary citizens with extraordinary courage, helped to sustain the refugees' will to survive. The presence of these allies created a small but crucial sliver of hope in a world where the refugees' plight was often met with indifference or hostility. One of the most well-known examples of these non-Jewish allies was the efforts of individuals who helped refugees escape through safe houses or hidden routes. In countries like France, many citizens risked their lives by hiding Jews in their homes, providing them with false papers or helping them cross borders to safety. These acts of defiance were often done at great personal risk. If caught, the penalty for aiding Jews was severe, ranging from imprisonment to execution. And yet, despite these dangers, these non-Jewish allies took the chance. Their actions, though quietly heroic, were often unknown to the world during the war, but their legacy is crucial. and understanding how survival was made possible for so many refugees. You can imagine as you slip through a hidden doorway or navigate a secret escape route, the weight of knowing that one wrong move could cost someone their life. Yet these heroes of the shadows doctors, farmers teachers provided the essential networks of support that allowed some refugees to escape their captors. With their help, refugees were able to find shelter in places that were otherwise considered too dangerous, and many managed to make it to places where they could continue their fight for survival, sometimes even in neutral countries. While these acts of kindness and courage are inspiring, they also point to the broader moral struggle that took place during World War II. The question that still lingers in the minds of many historians is, why did some people choose to risk everything for the sake of strangers? Was it purely out of moral duty, or was there something else, perhaps a shared humanity, that inspired them to act? Some suggest that the very nature of the Nazi regime, with its brutality and inhumanity, prompted a fierce resistance from those who simply could not sit idly by. Others believe that these non-Jewish rescuers were motivated by personal connections, having witnessed the suffering of their neighbors and knowing they couldn't stand by. What remains most striking about the actions of these non-Jewish allies is the deeply personal nature of their resistance. They didn't just help from a distance, they were often physically involved, risking their own lives to help individuals who had been dehumanized by the Nazis. And it wasn't just the political resistors, but also everyday people who chose to act. They didn't wait for the right time or the perfect opportunity. Instead, they saw the suffering of their fellow humans and chose to act. As you think about the incredible courage these rescuers displayed, consider the moral questions that come with such choices. What drives someone to risk everything to help a stranger knowing the devastating consequences they could face if caught? These decisions, often made in the quiet moments of terror, formed an essential part of the network that allowed refugees to survive. For many survivors, the presence of these helpers was a reminder that not all humanity had been lost, not in the camps and not in the world. Even in the darkest times, there were those who held fast to the light. The legacy of these non-Jewish allies lives on in the stories of those they saved. While the numbers of Jews who managed to escape the Nazis through these underground networks might be difficult to quantify, the importance of these individuals cannot be overstated. Their actions, their courage, and their belief in the sanctity of life in the face of unthinkable evil were pivotal in helping many Jewish refugees survive. Tonight, as you rest, reflect on the incredible courage of those who risked everything to help others. These ordinary people became extraordinary heroes, and their actions remind us of the power of compassion, the strength of resistance, and the unbreakable will to protect life, even in the face of overwhelming evil. They were the silent warriors of the Holocaust, and their bravery continues to inspire us today. As the story of Jewish refugees during WWII continues to unfold, it's important to take a moment to reflect on one of the most significant factors in their survival, the role of youth in the camps. For many of the children and young people trapped in the camps, survival was not just about enduring harsh conditions. It was about learning how to adapt, grow, and protect their futures in the face of overwhelming adversity. The experience of children in the camps was both heartbreaking and inspiring. While they faced the same hardships as the adults fear hunger disease, their resilience and ability to cope were in many ways a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the most dire circumstances. Picture yourself as a child in one of these camps, far from home, isolated from the world you once knew, surrounded by strangers and constantly unsure of what tomorrow would bring. You watch your parents who are struggling to survive doing everything they can to keep your spirits up. But even in the face of their own exhaustion and fear, they still try to preserve moments of childhood for you. Perhaps they whisper stories from before the war, sharing memories of a life that seemed so distant now. In a way, they are trying to protect your innocence to remind you of a world before all of this chaos. But it's hard to hold on to innocence in a place like this. The camps were no place for children. They were overcrowded with little to offer in terms of safety or comfort. The lack of proper shelter, food, and sanitation made it even harder for children to survive, and the constant fear of detection only added to the stress. For young children, the world became one of uncertainty and confusion. They had to learn quickly how to navigate the dangers of the camp, how to avoid suspicion, how to stay hidden, and how to endure the fear that came with each passing day. The older children, many of them teenagers, often found themselves in positions of responsibility, having to take care of younger siblings or even help adults with tasks like finding food or managing the small resources available. While the daily hardships were difficult for everyone in the camp, the emotional toll on children was profound. For many of them, the war stole not just their homes, but their childhoods. They had to grow up quickly in a world that had no room for innocence. And yet, despite the overwhelming grief and trauma, many children showed remarkable resilience. They formed close-knit bonds with other children, creating a sense of camaraderie that helped them cope. They would play games when they could, even if those games were simple and improvised, using whatever they had at hand. These small moments of normalcy of laughter shared among peers became vital to their survival. They were, in essence, reclaiming their humanity in a place that tried to strip it away. Historians have often noted the adaptability of young people in the camps. While adults were burdened by the weight of responsibility and the trauma of what had already been lost, children had an incredible ability to adapt to their changing surroundings. Some children became incredibly resourceful, finding ways to acquire food or to protect themselves from the dangers of the camp. Others became skilled at evading the authorities, using their youth and innocence as a shield to avoid suspicion. The camp, with all its harshness, forced them to grow up quickly, but it also allowed them to demonstrate a level of resourcefulness that was often far beyond their years. The impact of these experiences on the children's futures was profound. Many of the survivors of these camps carried the psychological scars of their childhood for the rest of their lives. They grew up too quickly, forced to witness and endure horrors that no child should ever have to face. But despite the trauma, many of these children went on to rebuild their lives after the war. Some found ways to reconnect with surviving family members, while others struggled to find a place in a world that had been so deeply scarred by the Holocaust. Some children who survived the camps went on to become leaders in the Jewish community, while others dedicated their lives to preserving the memory of those who did not survive. This trauma of family separation continued long after the war had ended. The survivors, whether children or adults, faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, and for some reconnecting with surviving family members. The emotional toll of the Holocaust wasn't just in the immediate trauma of living through the camps. It was in the aftermath, in the years that followed, when refugees had to try to reestablish the familial bonds that had been torn apart. For some, this meant searching for lost relatives in emotional and often unsuccessful quest. For others, it meant trying to make sense of the family members they had lost and figuring out how to move forward in a world that felt forever changed. Tonight, as you settle in and think about the survival of refugees during WWII, consider the central role that family played in their endurance. Despite the overwhelming odds, the love and solidarity shared between family members helped many of these refugees survive. The separation from family was one of the most painful aspects of their experience, but it was also the reminder that even in the most brutal of circumstances, the bonds of love and loyalty could still endure. For many refugees, it was these familial connections that helped them maintain hope and resilience, no matter how dire the situation became. As we continue, let's delve into a more specific aspect of survival in the camps, the crucial role of health and disease. When you step into a camp, it's hard not to notice the sickness that permeates the air, the frailty in the faces of the people around you. The stories of successful escapes, however, were nothing short of remarkable. Some refugees managed to evade Nazi detection through sheer luck, others with the help of sympathetic locals who were willing to risk their lives. The underground resistance played a key role in facilitating these escapes, providing routes, false documents, and safe houses to hide the refugees. For these survivors, escape represented a chance at new life. But it also came with the knowledge that the risk had been enormous, and that their survival had come down to a handful of moments, decisions made, in secret actions taken under cover of darkness. Historians often reflect on the psychological toll that these failed escape attempts took on the refugees. The constant threat of betrayal, the anguish of seeing friends and family members taken away or executed for attempting to flee, created an atmosphere of deep despair. Yet despite these repeated setbacks, the human will to escape the horrors of the camp never fully waned. Each new attempt, even when it failed, was a testament to the determination to survive and the refusal to accept the fate imposed by the Nazis. Despite the many failures, the escape attempts of those refugees remain a symbol of the courage and resilience that defined so many survivors of the Holocaust. They are stories of defiance, stories of individuals who, in the face of complete despair, refuse to give up, refuse to let fear control their future. And while the majority of refugees didn't escape, the fact that so many tried speaks to the strength of the human spirit, a strength that survived even in the most difficult of circumstances. As we continue to explore the harrowing experiences of Jewish refugees in the camps, let's take a step back and examine the crucial role of memory and storytelling in the camps. In places where death, disease, and despair were daily companions, maintaining a sense of identity of who they were before the war became a matter of survival. For many refugees, the stories they told, whether in whispered conversations, letters, or secret gatherings, became a vital lifeline that helped them cling to their humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. These stories weren't just about remembering, they were about resisting. They were a refusal to let the Nazis erase their past, their culture, and their very existence. In the oppressive silence of the camp, you might find yourself sitting with others recounting memories of the world before the war. The world where families lived together, where towns were vibrant, and where futures seemed certain. These stories became a way of holding on to the past, of keeping alive the part of them that had been torn away. Sharing these stories in the camps was also an act of resistance. It was a statement that they, as individuals and as a people, were still here, still fighting for survival, still remembering. By sharing their stories, refugees were ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten. They were preserving the memory of their existence even when the world seemed to want to erase them. The significance of storytelling was particularly important in preserving the collective Jewish identity. Jewish traditions, religious, cultural, familial, were passed down through generations, not just by rituals and practices, but by stories. In the camps where so many aspects of Jewish life were destroyed, storytelling became a way of maintaining continuity with the past. These stories told in secret became more than just recollections of happier times. They became tools for survival. They provided comfort, hope, and a sense of connection to something larger than the chaos and brutality of camp life. In many ways, storytelling was a means of reclaiming a lost sense of normalcy. Refugees would often recount tales of their lives before the war, of the bustling streets of their cities, the warmth of their homes, and the traditions that defined their families. These memories, though bittersweet, allowed them to hold on to their cultural identity. The act of speaking these stories out loud in the company of others who shared the same trauma became a powerful way to assert their continued existence. In a place where nothing felt safe, nothing was certain, and the future seemed impossible to imagine, the stories of the past became a way of anchoring their sense of self. Historians still reflect on the importance of these stories in the camps. Did the act of storytelling help refugees to survive emotionally and psychologically? Did it provide the mental fortitude needed to endure the ongoing suffering? Some argue that the sharing of these stories helped to maintain morale, providing the sense of unity and continuity amid the chaos. Others suggest that the memories, while comforting, may have kept some refugees trapped in the past, unable to fully engage with the brutal present. Yet what cannot be denied is that these stories allowed the refugees to preserve a part of themselves, something they could hold on to when everything else was slipping away. The role of storytelling also had a profound impact on future generations. For many survivors, the memories of their experiences in the camps became the foundation of post-war narratives. These stories passed down to children, grandchildren, and the world became part of the collective memory of the Holocaust. The stories told in the camps were the building blocks for the testimonies that would later shape public understanding of the atrocities. These first-hand accounts, which had often been shared in hushed tones within the camp walls, would eventually help ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust would not be forgotten. Survivors became witnesses, sharing their stories with the world, ensuring that future generations understood the depth of the suffering they had endured and the strength they had shown in the face of it. As you reflect tonight, think about the power of memory. In the face of the overwhelming darkness of the camps, the refugees' stories acted as a beacon of light, guiding them through the terror. These stories weren't just about the past, they were about survival. They were a way of keeping the flame of hope alive when the world outside seemed to have abandoned them. By telling their stories, these refugees defied the Nazis' efforts to erase them, not just physically, but culturally, spiritually, and emotionally. They showed that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could endure. And that in itself was an act of resistance. Now that we've explored the crucial role of memory and storytelling, let's turn our attention to the profound impact of the war's end on the refugees and their futures. When the war finally ended in 1945, there was no great relief for many of those who had endured years of suffering in the camps. While the world rejoiced in the defeat of the Nazis, the reality for survivors was much more complex. For the Jewish refugees, the war had destroyed everything they once knew, their homes, their communities, and often their families. The world they returned to or hoped to return to was no longer the same. The trauma, loss, and separation they had experienced in the camps continued to haunt them long after the war was over. The end of the war did not suddenly undo the damage. The refugees had to navigate a new world, one that was just as uncertain and chaotic as the one they had escaped. Many were left without homes, without families, and without any clear idea of where they would go. Some sought to return to their countries of origin, only to find that their homes had been destroyed or that the communities they had once been part of had vanished. Others, unable to go back, found themselves displaced once again, seeking new places to settle and start over. The refugee camps, once the sites of immediate survival, became a place where many remained for months or even years after the war, as they struggled to rebuild their lives. Imagine for a moment the sense of isolation and uncertainty that comes with being a survivor in the post-war world. You've endured the worst horrors humanity can inflict, only to find that the world around you has moved on without you. There are no welcoming arms, no guarantees of safety. The trauma of the past doesn't simply fade away, it lingers, a constant presence that shapes every aspect of your existence. You are left to rebuild, but you have no idea how. The process of recovery, physically and emotionally, is long and difficult. And for many refugees, it feels like a constant uphill battle. One of the most challenging aspects of this post-war period was the lack of support. While there were international efforts to assist displaced persons, the sheer scale of the refugee crisis meant that help was limited. The war had left much of Europe in ruins, and the resources available to support refugees were stretched thin. Many of the survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives without the assistance they needed. Some survivors were able to find work or build new communities, but for others, the scars of their experience in the camps were too deep to overcome. The trauma of losing everything, of being stripped of one's identity, and of living through such horrors left many feeling adrift in a world that no longer felt like home. The emotional toll of the refugee experience didn't end when the war did. Many survivors carried the psychological scars of their time in the camps with them for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, depression, and a sense of alienation were common among Holocaust survivors. The inability to speak about their experiences, the silence of trauma, meant that many survivors struggled to process what had happened to them. Even if they were able to escape the physical confines of the camps, they could never truly escape the emotional and psychological weight of what they had endured. Historians still debate the long-term effects of the Holocaust on survivors. Some argue that the trauma was so profound that it shaped the way future generations of Jews saw the world, while others believe that the resilience of the survivors ultimately allowed them to rebuild their lives. What is certain is that the experiences of those who lived through the camps, those who lost everything, who rebuilt from nothing, shaped the generations that came after them. The survivors became the carriers of a painful but important legacy, one that ensured the horrors of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. For some refugees, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter. Many found new homes in countries like the United States, Canada, and Israel where they could start over. These new beginnings were not without their challenges. For many, adapting to life in a new country and a foreign culture was difficult. Language barriers, unfamiliar customs, and the absence of family made integration a complex process. Yet despite these challenges, many survivors found ways to rebuild their lives. They became active members of their new communities, and some went on to play significant roles in shaping the future of the Jewish diaspora. Their resilience, their ability to adapt to new circumstances, and their desire to preserve the memory of those who perished were central to the rebuilding process. For others, the aftermath of the war remained a painful and ongoing struggle. They couldn't escape the trauma they had experienced, nor could they forget the families they had lost. The journey of rebuilding was long and the emotional wounds were deep. Yet, even in the face of such profound loss, these refugees found a way to survive. They held on to the stories of the past, and through those stories, they ensured that the legacy of those lost would not be forgotten. Through their voices, the Holocaust became more than just a historical event. It became a living memory, one that would pass down through generations. Tonight, as you reflect, consider the enduring strength it took for the refugees to rebuild after the war. The Holocaust may have shattered their lives, but their ability to survive, to rebuild, and to preserve the memory of those they had lost speaks to the indomitable human spirit. The war ended, but the struggle to find peace, to find home, and to reclaim identity continued long after the camps were emptied. The survivors' journeys became one of resilience, remembrance, and the relentless fight to carry their stories forward. As we move forward, let's explore one of the most critical aspects of the post-war refugee experience, the emergence of Jewish resistance movements within the camps, and the role they played in shaping the narrative of survival. Despite the overwhelming conditions they faced, Jewish refugees did not simply passively accept their fate. As we've seen, survival was not just about enduring physical deprivation, it was about maintaining a sense of self, of dignity, and perhaps most importantly, resisting the forces that sought to dehumanize them. Even within the confines of the camps, there were those who fought back in whatever way they could. One of the most remarkable acts of resistance in the camps was the attempt to preserve and transmit Jewish culture. Many refugees formed secret cultural organizations within the camps, holding clandestine classes, lectures, and discussions. They didn't just want to survive, they wanted to ensure that their identity, their traditions, and their history would not be erased. These cultural movements, although small and largely hidden, were a form of resistance against the Nazis' systematic attempt to obliterate Jewish life and culture. Even within the most brutal environments, refugees found ways to create and preserve the essence of what it meant to be Jewish. Historians still debate the impact of these resistance efforts. Some argue that these acts of defiance were essential to the mental and emotional survival of the refugees, while others suggest that they were more symbolic than practical, given the overwhelming odds they faced. Regardless, the importance of these movements cannot be overstated. They were acts of survival, but also of hope. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can resist, adapt, and preserve what is most precious. The larger, more visible uprisings in the camps also demonstrated the refugees' refusal to accept their fate without a fight. In some instances, armed resistance movements formed within the camps, attempting to escape or sabotage the Nazi system from within. These uprisings were dangerous and often ended in tragedy. But for those who participated, the act of resistance was a means of reclaiming power over their own lives. It was a way of saying, "We will not go quietly into the night. We will fight for our survival, for our families, and for the memory of those we have lost. As the war continued, many of these resistance groups, while still operating within the camps, also worked to find ways to help refugees escape or secure their passage to safer countries. These underground movements, often hidden from the watchful eyes of Nazi officers, were an essential part of the network that helped many refugees survive. The very existence of these groups represented a direct challenge to the Nazis' control, and their persistence in the face of enormous risks showed the indomitable will of those who had already lost so much. But of course, not every resistance movement succeeded. Many were betrayed, and many of the individuals involved paid the ultimate price. In the harsh environment of the camps, resistance was often a matter of life and death, and failure could mean not only the loss of life, but the loss of any hope of escape. Yet even in failure, these resistance movements served as a powerful testament to the courage of those who were willing to risk everything for their freedom and for the survival of their people. As you lie back tonight, think about the incredible strength it took for these refugees to resist, to fight back in the only way they could. The existence of these resistance movements, however small or hidden, is proof that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit will find a way to assert its dignity, its worth, and its humanity. They resisted because even in the depths of despair, they believed that survival meant more than just existing. It meant living with pride, with honor, and with a commitment to preserving their identity and culture, no matter the cost. Now that we've discussed the resilience of Jewish refugees through their acts of resistance, let's turn our attention to one of the most persistent and painful challenges faced by refugees in the camps: the uncertainty of their futures. When the war ended and the immediate threat of Nazi occupation was lifted, one might think that the survivors would have found peace. However, the reality was far more complex. Imagine yourself after years of suffering hearing the news that the war has ended. The initial relief might be overwhelming. For a brief moment, you might allow yourself to believe that the nightmare is over. But as you step outside, the streets are no longer familiar. The places you once called home have been destroyed, and you find that those who survived are scattered, lost in the chaos of a world that has moved on without you. Where do you go now? What is left of the life you once knew? And perhaps the most pressing question: what will happen to your family? The uncertainty of the future in the aftermath of the war was one of the cruelest aspects of the refugee experience. The refugee camps, which had been a place of temporary shelter, now became permanent homes for many survivors. For some, the camps represented the only safe haven, but they were no longer a sanctuary. They had become overcrowded, deteriorating spaces of limbo. There was no clear path forward for many of these survivors. Some hoped to return to their countries of origin, but in many cases this was not possible. The devastation of war had wiped out entire communities, and those who had once been citizens of these places now found themselves unwelcome in their own homelands. Anti-Semitism, which had fueled the persecution of Jews in the first place, did not end with the defeat of the Nazis. In fact, many Jewish refugees found that they had nowhere to return, to no place to call home. Historians continue to debate the scale and effectiveness of post-war assistance for Jewish refugees. Some argue that the efforts to provide shelter, food, and medical care were insufficient to meet the needs of such a vast population, while international organizations like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the Jewish Agency for Palestine worked tirelessly to provide aid. The sheer number of refugees left displaced by the war was staggering. The bureaucratic obstacles that existed in these efforts further complicated matters, as many Jewish refugees were forced to wait for months or even years before they could find a new place to settle. For many, emigration to other countries became their only option. The hope of finding a new life elsewhere drove many refugees to seek asylum in countries like the United States, Canada, and Israel. The journey to new lands was not easy, however. Immigration quotas, political resistance, and the lingering trauma of the war made it difficult for survivors to gain acceptance. In many cases, Jewish refugees faced significant hurdles when applying for immigration visas, often forced to wait years before being allowed to leave the camps. Some were turned away outright as countries sought to limit the number of refugees they were willing to take in. For those fortunate enough to secure a passage, the journey was fraught with uncertainty. Would they find acceptance? Would they be able to rebuild their lives? The future for so many remained unclear. For those who found their way to Israel, the situation was equally fraught. While Israel was founded as a Jewish state in 1948, it was still in its infancy and struggling to absorb the wave of new immigrants. The Jewish refugees who arrived there faced numerous challenges, from the logistical difficulties of integrating into a new society to the emotional toll of starting over in a foreign land. Despite these challenges, Israel became a place where many survivors sought to rebuild their lives, drawn by the promise of a homeland where they could live in safety and rebuild their communities. Historians have noted that the uncertainty of the post-war period left an indelible mark on the survivors. While some were able to rebuild their lives and find a sense of peace in their new homes, others continued to carry the scars of their experiences with them. The trauma of the camps, along with the dislocation and the loss of family, haunted many survivors even as they worked to create new lives for themselves. The idea of home, once so solid and comforting, had become fluid and elusive. It was no longer something tied to a particular place. It was something the survivors had to create from scratch, piece by piece. In addition to the physical and emotional challenges of rebuilding, survivors also faced the daunting task of preserving the memory of the millions of Jews who had been murdered in the Holocaust. For many refugees, this was not just a personal journey, it was a collective one. They knew that it was essential to bear witness to ensure that the atrocities of the Holocaust would not be forgotten. Survivors became the custodians of memory, passing on their stories to the next generation, and in doing so, helping to preserve the legacy of the victims. The very act of surviving became a form of resistance, not just to the Nazis, but to the forces that sought to erase the truth of what had happened. As you reflect tonight, consider the uncertainty these survivors faced in the years following the war. The war might have ended, but their struggle was far from over. The quest for a place to call home, for a future that seemed uncertain at best, was a long and painful journey. The survival of these refugees was not just about escaping the camps. It was about trying to rebuild, to find a new identity, and to hold on to the memory of those lost. Their stories are a reminder that survival is not just about escaping death, it's about reclaiming life even when the road ahead seems impossible. As we delve deeper into the stories of Jewish refugees, it's impossible to overlook one of the most profound aspects of their post-war journey: the emotional and psychological cost of survival. While the physical challenges of rebuilding their lives were immense, the emotional scars they carried were just as deep. The trauma of the camps, the loss of family members, the uncertainty of the future, these were not experiences that could be easily erased or forgotten. Survivors carried with them a heavy burden, one that would shape their lives long after the war ended. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a Holocaust survivor. You've made it through the unimaginable, the overcrowded camps, the constant fear, the daily battle for survival. But now the war is over and you're free. You should be able to move forward, rebuild, and live a new life. Yet, as you try to settle into a new home, there's something inside you that just doesn't feel right. You have flashbacks to the camp, to the faces of those you lost, and you carry a heavy weight that no one can see. The trauma doesn't just disappear. It lingers in your mind and body, affecting how you interact with the world around you. For many survivors, this emotional toll was compounded by the difficulty of processing the immense grief they had experienced. The loss of loved ones, parents, children, spouses, siblings was a wound that could never fully heal. Even if they managed to escape the physical brutality of the camps, they could never escape the emotional devastation of losing so many people. For those who had been separated from their families, the uncertainty of whether their loved ones had survived haunted them for years. Many were left with incomplete knowledge about their family members' fates, and the lack of closure made the trauma even more acute. The psychological scars of surviving the Holocaust were complex. Survivors often struggled with feelings of guilt. Survivors' guilt, the feeling that they had somehow betrayed the memory of those who did not make it out. This guilt was particularly pronounced for those who had lost their families. They carried the weight of knowing that they had survived, but their loved ones had not. Some survivors felt deep shame for the very act of surviving, as though their lives were somehow worth less because others had perished. Historians still debate the extent to which post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affected Holocaust survivors. Many survivors showed signs of what we now recognize as PTSD, including nightmares, flashbacks, and intense emotional distress. Yet for survivors, the psychological toll was often compounded by the fact that they had to keep moving forward. They didn't have the luxury of time to process their grief. They had to rebuild their lives, to take care of their families, to find a place in a world that seemed forever changed. In many ways, survival was a full-time job, one that didn't allow for emotional recovery. While some survivors sought therapy or counseling to help them process their trauma, others found ways to cope on their own. Many turned to religion or spirituality, finding comfort in their faith. Some dedicated themselves to rebuilding Jewish communities, preserving the memory of those who had perished. Others tried to create new families, having children, and raising them in a world that was slowly healing from the wounds of war. These efforts, while healing in their own way, didn't completely erase the emotional scars. The past always lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered by a smell, a sound, or a fleeting memory. The emotional and psychological impact of the Holocaust didn't just affect the survivors, it affected the generations that followed. Children of Holocaust survivors often grew up in homes where the trauma of their parents was passed down not through stories, but through silence, through unspoken pain. The weight of the survivors' experiences often shaped their children's lives in ways they didn't fully understand. Survivor families often struggled with communication, with expressing feelings, and with finding a sense of normalcy. For many children of survivors, the legacy of trauma was something they had to navigate, as well as they tried to understand their parents' experiences and how those experiences shaped their lives. Historians have begun to explore the long-term effects of this intergenerational trauma. The impact of the Holocaust on the children of survivors is an area of study that continues to evolve. How did the experiences of the first generation of refugees shape the second generation? How did children of survivors cope with the weight of their parents' memories and trauma? What's clear is that the legacy of the Holocaust didn't end with the war, it was passed down in various ways to future generations. And while the trauma may not have been as visible as the scars of war, it was just as real. Tonight, as you reflect on this, consider the emotional resilience it took for these survivors to keep going. They didn't just survive the camps, they survived the psychological aftermath, a struggle that continues for many to this day. The trauma of the Holocaust wasn't just about the brutality of the camps. It was about the emotional and psychological toll of losing everything and living through a nightmare only to face the challenge of rebuilding and continuing in a world that seemed forever scarred. Their survival wasn't just a matter of physical endurance. It was about finding a way to live with the memories, to process the loss, and to pass on the stories of those who didn't survive. As we continue to explore the multifaceted experience of Jewish refugees, we must acknowledge the resilience of the community's spirit, even in the face of such overwhelming loss and trauma. One of the most profound aspects of their survival was the drive to rebuild family community and a sense of identity in a world that had torn them apart. The post-war period was not just about physically surviving, it was about finding a way to carry on living with purpose despite the emotional and physical scars. For many survivors, rebuilding their lives after the war became a process of redefining what it meant to be Jewish, to be human, and to preserve the memory of those lost. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to stand amidst the wreckage of everything you once knew. Homes, neighborhoods, schools, places of worship, and try to figure out where to go next. The world you knew is gone, and yet you are still here. For the survivors of the camps, the task of rebuilding wasn't just about surviving day to day. It was about creating a future where their identities, their traditions, and their cultures would continue to thrive. But this task was made all the more difficult by the emotional weight they carried. One of the key ways refugees began to rebuild was through the creation of community. In a world that had nearly destroyed their people, they found strength in coming together. For Jewish survivors, this meant re-establishing Jewish communities wherever they could, whether in displaced persons camps or in newly formed neighborhoods. The goal wasn't simply survival, but the continuation of Jewish life. Synagogue schools and cultural institutions were established in the aftermath of the war, helping to preserve the traditions and values that had been targeted by the Nazis. The goal was clear: to ensure that Jewish life would continue even in the face of such enormous loss. This rebuilding process wasn't just about physical structures, it was about rebuilding hope. For survivors, the act of coming together was a form of resistance against the Nazis' ultimate goal, the annihilation of the Jewish people. Every community that was formed, every tradition that was preserved, was an act of defiance. It was a way of asserting that they had survived not only the physical destruction of the war, but the attempt to erase their identity from history. Their survival was in many ways a testament to the strength of their collective spirit. As they rebuilt, survivors also faced the challenge of preserving the memory of the millions who had been lost. For many, this meant passing on their stories to the next generation. They told their children about the lives they had lived before the war, about the families they had lost, and about the resilience that had allowed them to survive. In doing so, they ensured that the memories of the Holocaust would never fade no matter how many years had passed. The act of remembering became a vital part of the process of rebuilding. It was not just about honoring the past, it was about ensuring that the horrors of the Holocaust would never be forgotten, that future generations would understand what had happened and carry the lessons forward. Historians note that the experience of rebuilding Jewish communities after the war was a complex and long-term process. Many survivors had to grapple with the emotional toll of rebuilding their lives while simultaneously carrying the trauma of the Holocaust. Some survivors struggled with the constant tension between moving forward and never forgetting the past. For others, the trauma was so deep that they found it difficult to engage with their new lives, always haunted by the memories of the camps. Yet, despite these challenges, the survivors continued to rebuild, and in many cases, they found ways to create new families, new homes, and new lives. For those who survived, the desire to preserve their culture and traditions became more than just a means of survival. It became a symbol of their defiance and resilience. Jewish refugees found ways to continue living even after everything they had known had been destroyed. Their stories, passed down through generations, ensured that the lessons of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. And in rebuilding their communities, they also laid the groundwork for the future of the Jewish people. They demonstrated that despite everything the Nazis had done to erase them, the Jewish people would endure. As you reflect tonight, think about the strength it took for these survivors to rebuild from nothing. To lose everything, your family, your home, your community, and still find the courage to move forward is an extraordinary feat. Their ability to come together to rebuild their traditions and to pass on their stories speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. In a world that tried to break them, they chose to resist, to rebuild, and to continue living with pride. Their survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about finding a way to thrive even after all they had lost. As we continue our exploration of the post-war lives of Jewish refugees, it's essential to examine one of the most significant aspects of their survival and rebuilding: the role of the Jewish diaspora and the global Jewish community. After the war, as survivors sought to rebuild their lives, they often found themselves in unfamiliar lands, struggling to establish new roots. But despite the physical distance from their homeland, they found strength in their shared identity and in the broader Jewish community, which, though dispersed across the world, offered solidarity, support, and a sense of belonging. Imagine yourself in one of these new lands, a survivor still haunted by the memories of the camps, but now faced with the reality of starting over. The world feels vast and everything is unfamiliar. The language, the customs, the way people interact, it's all different. Yet amid the overwhelming changes, there is a familiar thread that tugs at you: your connection to the Jewish people, to the tradition, the culture, and the faith that have sustained you. This shared bond, felt across the globe, becomes a lifeline, reminding you that you are not alone. For Jewish refugees, one of the most critical elements of post-war recovery was the support they received from the global Jewish community. Jewish organizations such as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, and the World Jewish Congress were instrumental in providing financial, medical, and psychological aid to survivors in the aftermath of the war. These organizations helped refugees find new homes, secure employment, and access the resources they needed to rebuild. The sense of solidarity within the Jewish community, even when spread across multiple countries, allowed survivors to feel connected to something larger than themselves. However, this solidarity didn't come without its challenges. Jewish refugees who had survived the camps were now part of a broader global community that had its own complex dynamics. Many survivors had different experiences depending on where they had been during the war, and these differences sometimes led to tensions within the diaspora. Survivors who had spent years in the camps, for example, often felt disconnected from those who had lived in relative safety, and the emotional scars of the Holocaust sometimes led to misunderstandings or even resentment. Yet, despite these challenges, the global Jewish community remained a powerful force of support, offering both practical assistance and emotional validation. In addition to the support from Jewish organizations, survivors found strength in the growing awareness of the Holocaust. As the atrocities of the war became more widely known, many refugees found a sense of solidarity not just within their own communities, but with the broader world. The recognition of the Holocaust, though long delayed, gave survivors a voice, a way of sharing their stories and ensuring that their experiences would be remembered. It was through this global awareness that the Jewish diaspora began to understand just how essential it was to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, not just for the survivors, but for future generations. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 also played a crucial role in the rebuilding of Jewish communities after the war. For many Holocaust survivors, Israel represented a new beginning, a homeland where they could live in safety, free from the fear of persecution. The creation of Israel was a pivotal moment for the Jewish people, providing both a symbol of hope and a physical space where the survivors could rebuild their lives. Israel became a place where refugees could reconnect with their roots and create new communities while also offering them the opportunity to contribute to the development of a new Jewish state. But while Israel offered refuge, it also posed new challenges for those who arrived there. The country was still in the process of being established, and it faced many of its own struggles, economic, political, and social. Refugees who arrived in Israel often found themselves in temporary camps, struggling to adjust to a new life. The language, the culture, and the political landscape were all foreign, and the psychological toll of the Holocaust made it difficult for many to find peace. Yet, despite these challenges, Israel became a place of rebuilding and renewal, where survivors could reclaim their identity and work together to establish a thriving Jewish homeland. For the global Jewish community, the aftermath of the war represented both a time of mourning and a time of rebuilding. The devastation of the Holocaust left a deep scar on the Jewish people, but it also strengthened their resolve to preserve their culture, their traditions, and their memory. Survivors found strength in knowing that they were part of a broader community that shared their history and that together they could rebuild. Tonight, as you reflect on the survivor's journey, consider the power of community and solidarity. The global Jewish community, despite its vast geographical spread, provided a sense of belonging and support for those who had lost everything. The shared bond of identity, culture, and faith became a source of strength for the survivors, helping them to navigate the immense challenges of rebuilding their lives. It is a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, we are never truly alone as long as we remain connected to one another. The Jewish diaspora, through its resilience and unity, ensured that the legacy of the Holocaust would live on and that future generations would continue to remember and honor the lives of those lost. As we continue exploring the aftermath of the Holocaust for Jewish refugees, one of the most significant challenges they faced was the loss of trust in the world around them. After years of living in constant fear under threat of death and betrayal, many survivors found it difficult to reestablish the kind of trust that is essential for rebuilding their lives. In the camps, trust had been a rare commodity. Betrayal was a constant danger, and the very nature of survival meant that one had to be cautious, skeptical, and guarded. The emotional and psychological impact of this broken trust would stay with many survivors long after the war ended. Imagine yourself emerging from the camp after the war, a survivor of unimaginable horrors. The world around you seems foreign, even hostile. After years of living in a constant state of fear and uncertainty, you find it difficult to believe that people could be trusted again. The very idea of safety, of belonging, feels like an illusion. How can you trust anyone after everything you've been through? You've been betrayed by governments, by neighbors, and sometimes even by those who seemed like fellow refugees. The trauma of betrayal isn't just about the physical loss, it's about the emotional cost of having your sense of security shattered. For many survivors, the task of rebuilding their lives wasn't just about finding a home or a job. It was about learning how to trust again. The act of reintegrating into society after such a prolonged period of isolation and danger was a monumental task. The trauma of betrayal didn't just affect survivors during the war. It continued to affect their relationships and interactions with others long after the war ended. The emotional scars of living through years of deception, suspicion, and fear ran deep. And for many survivors, the ability to open up to others, to trust in the kindness of strangers, was something that had to be slowly rebuilt. Historians still debate the long-term psychological effects of the betrayal survivors experienced during the war. Some suggest that the inability to trust others may have contributed to survivors' difficulties in adjusting to post-war life, while others argue that survivors showed remarkable resilience by rebuilding their relationships, their families, and their communities, despite the deep psychological scars they carried. What is clear, however, is that the experience of betrayal created a fractured sense of trust, one that survivors had to work hard to repair. One of the most profound challenges for survivors was the question of whether they could trust the world at large. In the aftermath of the war, the global response to the Holocaust and its survivors was mixed. While many countries, including the United States and Canada, opened their doors to Jewish refugees, others were less welcoming. There was a deep-seated fear of more refugees entering post-war societies, and many countries, despite their moral obligations, set strict immigration quotas that prevented large numbers of refugees from finding safety. The very governments that had failed to intervene or protect Jews during the war now seemed unwilling to offer refuge. The mistrust of governments, of global institutions, was one that many survivors carried with them, making it harder for them to feel accepted in the new countries they called home. The social dynamics within these new communities were also fraught with tension. Survivors often faced a dual burden of trying to rebuild their own lives while simultaneously confronting the discomfort of those around them, who could not fully understand or process their trauma. Even within Jewish communities, there were differences in the ways survivors were received. Some were welcomed with open arms, while others were met with cold indifference. The emotional burden of trying to navigate this complex web of social interactions was yet another challenge that survivors had to overcome. But despite the immense challenges, many survivors found ways to rebuild their lives and slowly regain their trust in others. One of the most significant factors in this rebuilding process was the creation of new families. For survivors who had lost their parents, spouses, or children, the desire to create new life became a central goal. Many survivors went on to marry, have children, and build new homes. This process of creating new families was not just about replacing what had been lost. It was about asserting their will to live, to continue, and to ensure that the legacy of those who perished would not be forgotten. The act of bringing new life into the world was in a way an act of resistance, a statement that the survivors would not let the Holocaust define them forever. Additionally, survivors found strength in the communities they built, whether those were made up of fellow refugees, fellow Jews, or other displaced persons. Despite the trauma, the mistrust, and the uncertainty, these communities became vital spaces of support, where survivors could heal together, share their stories, and help each other navigate the challenges of rebuilding their lives. The sense of solidarity that existed within these communities was often what helped survivors find hope again. Tonight, as you reflect on the long journey of survival that these refugees endured, consider the immense challenge of rebuilding trust in a world that had betrayed them. The trauma of the Holocaust wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and social. Survivors had to rebuild not just their lives, but their relationships with others and with the world at large. The emotional scars of betrayal ran deep, but through community solidarity and the creation of new families, many survivors found a way to heal, rebuild, and reclaim their place in the world. As we continue to explore the aftermath of the Holocaust, we now turn to an essential aspect of the survivors' journey, the role of memory and the preservation of their stories. The Holocaust, with its immense tragedy, not only left scars on the survivors, but also became a part of global history, one that needed to be told and remembered. For Jewish refugees, the act of telling their stories became a crucial way of resisting the attempts to erase the history of their suffering and loss. These survivors knew that their personal experiences and the collective memory of the millions lost needed to be passed on not just for the sake of remembrance, but to ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. Imagine yourself a survivor years after the war, standing before a crowd preparing to tell your story. The memories are still vivid, the fear, the suffering, the loss. And yet you know that in telling your story, you are doing more than reliving the pain. You are ensuring that the world will never forget what happened. You are giving voice to those who were silenced. You are preserving the memory of the millions who did not survive, making sure that their lives, their experiences, and their suffering will never be erased. For many survivors, this process of remembering was not just about preserving the past, it was about creating a legacy. They wanted future generations to understand what happened, to ensure that the atrocities committed during the Holocaust would serve as a powerful reminder to the world of the dangers of hatred, intolerance, and dehumanization. The survivors saw themselves as witnesses, as the last living links to a history that needed to be told. They became the bearers of a memory that would never fade, using their voices and their stories to educate others, and to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. Historians often note the profound significance of survivor testimonies in shaping the historical record of the Holocaust. These personal stories became one of the most important ways to document the events of the war, providing first-hand accounts of what happened in the camps, on the streets, and in the ghettos. Many survivors wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and participated in oral history projects to share their experiences. These accounts, though deeply painful to relive, were crucial in preserving the truth of what happened, ensuring that future generations would not forget the lessons of the past. However, the act of remembering was not always an easy one. For many survivors, recounting their experiences was emotionally and psychologically draining. The trauma of the Holocaust was not something that could be easily put into words, and reliving it was a difficult and painful process. Many survivors found it difficult to talk about their experiences, particularly with those who had not lived through the same horrors. The silence surrounding the trauma of the Holocaust created a barrier between survivors and the world around them. There was often a sense of isolation as survivors struggled to connect with those who couldn't fully comprehend the depth of their suffering. In addition, the emotional toll of remembering could sometimes be overwhelming. For those who had lost family members, friends, and entire communities, telling their stories often meant confronting the deep grief of their loss. Survivors' guilt, the feeling that they had somehow failed to protect their loved ones, was another emotional burden that many carried with them. The act of remembering, while important, was often bittersweet. It was a way of honoring those who had perished, but it was also a painful reminder of all that had been lost. Historians and scholars continue to explore the importance of survivor testimonies in shaping the collective memory of the Holocaust. How have these stories influenced the way we understand the events of war? How have they contributed to the global commitment to ensuring that such atrocities never happen again? While there is still much to learn, one thing is clear: the survivors' voices have been crucial in keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. Their stories have become a powerful tool for education, for reminding the world of the dangers of unchecked hatred and intolerance. The Holocaust is not just a chapter in history, it is a living memory that is passed on through generations. And it is through the survivors, their stories, and their legacy that we ensure the lessons of the past are never forgotten. These stories, though painful, are a form of resistance. They are a way of reclaiming what was lost, of asserting the value of human life and dignity, and of preserving the memory of those who perished. It is through these memories that we ensure the future remains vigilant against the forces of hatred and bigotry. As you reflect tonight, think about the power of memory. The survivors' ability to bear witness, to share their stories, and to preserve the memory of those lost speaks to the strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable suffering, they found a way to ensure that the Holocaust would never be forgotten. Their memories became the foundation of the future's understanding of the past, helping to shape a world where such atrocities are prevented. And in telling their stories, they made sure that the lessons of the Holocaust would continue to resonate for generations to come. As we continue to reflect on the survivors' journey, it's important to explore another crucial aspect of the post-war refugee experience: the struggle for justice and the pursuit of accountability. For many survivors, the war didn't end with the signing of peace treaties or the fall of Nazi Germany. It continued as they sought justice for the crimes committed against them and their families. The question of accountability for those who had participated in or facilitated the atrocities of the Holocaust was one that loomed large in the minds of survivors, and the post-war period saw both significant efforts and heartbreaking frustrations in the pursuit of justice. Imagine for a moment the survivor who has finally made it to a new life, perhaps in a refugee camp or in a new country, but still feels the weight of the past pressing on them. The people who did this to you, to your family, what happens to them now? For many survivors, this was not just a question of legal justice, it was a moral one. Could there ever be enough reparation for the atrocities they had endured? How could the world at large hold those responsible accountable for crimes of such unprecedented magnitude? One of the first and most notable attempts to seek justice came through the Nuremberg trials held in 1945 and 1946. These trials were groundbreaking in their scope and significance. For the first time in history, Nazi war criminals were held accountable for crimes against humanity, crimes of war and crimes against the Jewish people. The Nuremberg trials were meant to establish a legal precedent for dealing with war criminals, and they provided a platform for the international community to acknowledge the full scale of the Nazi regime's crimes. However, despite the high-profile nature of the trials, the survivors knew that many perpetrators escaped justice, either because they fled or because they were never identified. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the Nuremberg trials in delivering justice. While many Nazis were convicted, some argue that the trials were not enough to address the full extent of the suffering caused by the regime. The trials were seen by some as a first step toward holding perpetrators accountable, but not a comprehensive solution to the deep emotional and moral wounds left by the war. The survivors understood that no amount of punishment could undo the suffering they had experienced or bring back the loved ones they had lost. But for many, the trials were at least a symbol that the world acknowledged the enormity of what had happened, and that some form of justice was being pursued. After the Nuremberg trials, there were various efforts to bring Nazi collaborators to justice. However, these efforts were often hindered by political factors. Some countries, particularly in Europe, were more focused on rebuilding their societies than on seeking out war criminals. The Cold War created another barrier, as some Nazis were protected or overlooked for geopolitical reasons. The process of seeking justice became long drawn out and deeply frustrating for many survivors. The sense that the world was more focused on moving forward than on properly holding perpetrators accountable left many survivors feeling abandoned and betrayed. The quest for justice wasn't only a matter of seeking legal retribution. For many survivors, it was a personal journey. They wanted to confront the people who had caused their suffering, to have their stories heard, and to ensure that those responsible for their families' deaths faced the consequences of their actions. In the absence of legal accountability, some survivors took matters into their own hands, leading to acts of retribution against former Nazis. These acts, though rare and often symbolic, highlighted the deep desire for justice that the survivors felt could never be fully achieved through the legal system alone. Even as the survivors sought legal and moral accountability for the atrocities committed during the war, many also felt a deep need for reparations. In the aftermath of the war, several countries, most notably Germany, agreed to provide financial compensation to Holocaust survivors. While this was an important step, the survivors often felt conflicted about reparations. On one hand, they were grateful for the financial support which allowed many to rebuild their lives. On the other hand, many felt that no amount of money could ever compensate for the emotional and physical damage they had suffered. Reparations for many survivors were an acknowledgement of their pain, but they could never truly restore what had been lost. As you reflect tonight, consider the weight of the survivors' quest for justice. The atrocities of the Holocaust were so vast, so incomprehensible, that no amount of legal retribution or financial compensation could ever fully address the depth of the suffering. Yet for the survivors, the pursuit of justice was an essential part of their healing process. It was about ensuring that the world recognized their pain, their loss, and their resilience. And while justice may have been elusive for many, the survivors' refusal to let their suffering go unacknowledged was itself a powerful form of resistance. As we continue to explore the journey of Jewish refugees after World War II, it is important to reflect on one of the most complex aspects of the post-war experience, the emotional and psychological toll of rebuilding one's identity. For many survivors, the war had not just taken their families and homes, it had taken their sense of self. The trauma of living through the Holocaust, of enduring unimaginable loss and suffering, left deep scars on the survivors' identities. They had to rebuild not only their physical lives, but also their sense of who they were in a world that had changed forever. Imagine yourself as a Holocaust survivor walking into a new life. You've survived the brutality of the camps, the pain of separation, and the uncertainty of the post-war years. You are free, yet something is missing. Something that was once yours, something that defined you. The identity that you once had has been shattered. Your sense of home, family, and security is gone. The world feels different, and so do you. The process of rebuilding is not just about finding a place to live or a job to sustain you. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were lost, about rediscovering your place in a world that seems foreign, even hostile. For many survivors, rebuilding their identity was a gradual process. Some turned to religion for comfort, rediscovering their faith and spiritual practices as a way to reconnect with their Jewish roots. Others sought to rebuild their cultural identity by reconnecting with Jewish traditions, customs, and community life. The very act of preserving Jewish culture and heritage became an important part of rebuilding identity. In a world where everything seemed broken, these survivors held on to the essence of who they were, even if only in small, private moments. However, rebuilding one's identity was not just about reconnecting with the past, it was also about reconciling with the trauma of the Holocaust. For many survivors, the memories of the camps were impossible to escape. The trauma they carried with them was not just psychological, it was embodied in their every interaction, in the way they viewed the world and their relationships with others. Rebuilding one's identity in many ways meant learning to live with that trauma, to integrate it into one's life, without allowing it to define them entirely. It was a complex and often painful journey, one that required survivors to confront their past while also trying to move forward. Historians have studied the impact of trauma on survivors' identity reconstruction, noting that the process was often deeply personal and varied from one individual to another. Some survivors found solace in sharing their stories, either through writing or through oral testimony. For others, the trauma was so overwhelming that it was difficult to express or process. Some survivors turned inward, isolating themselves from others in an attempt to protect themselves from further pain. Yet, despite these differences, one common thread runs through the stories of all survivors: the need to find meaning in their suffering, to make sense of the incomprehensible. The rebuilding of identity also extended to the relationships survivors had with others. After the war, many survivors were left with no families to turn to. The grief of losing loved ones was compounded by the sense of isolation that came with being one of the few to survive. The process of creating new relationships, of rebuilding familial bonds, or creating new families became central to the survivor's ability to heal. Marriage, having children, and starting new families gave many survivors a sense of continuity, a sense of purpose. Yet even in the midst of these new beginnings, the shadow of the Holocaust lingered. Survivors struggled with survivors' guilt, the haunting question of why they lived when so many others died. As the years passed, survivors also faced the challenge of passing on their stories to future generations. Many survivors felt a deep responsibility to ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. They sought to pass on their experiences to their children, grandchildren, and the world at large so that future generations would understand what had happened and work to ensure that such atrocities were never repeated. But this process of sharing their stories was not always easy. For many survivors, the memories were too painful to relive, and the emotional toll of recounting their experiences often felt unbearable. Yet despite the pain, they knew that their stories needed to be told. The act of sharing was not just a way of preserving history, it was a way of reclaiming their identity and ensuring that the lessons of the past would not be lost. Historians often point to the tension between rebuilding and remembering as one of the most difficult aspects of the post-Holocaust experience. While survivors sought to rebuild their lives, they were also tasked with remembering those who did not survive. For many, this meant living with a sense of dual identity. They were survivors, but they were also witnesses to a tragedy that had consumed their families and their communities. The process of rebuilding was not just about healing. It was about preserving the memory of the lost and ensuring that their stories would never fade into obscurity. As you reflect tonight, consider the incredible strength it took for these survivors to rebuild their identities, to move forward after the war, to create new lives, new families, and new communities. Despite the trauma they carried with them, speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Their ability to rebuild was not just a physical act, it was an emotional and psychological journey, one that required confronting unimaginable loss while simultaneously forging ahead in a world that no longer felt like home. The survivor stories remind us of the power of memory, the strength of identity, and the ability of the human spirit to endure even in the most difficult circumstances. As we delve further into the lives of Jewish refugees after WWII, we must also explore a key element of the refugee experience: the role of education and the transmission of knowledge. For many survivors, the desire to preserve their cultural legacy wasn't just about memory and storytelling. It was also about ensuring that future generations would be equipped with the tools to understand the past, to learn from it, and to help prevent such horrors from ever happening again. Education became one of the most powerful methods by which survivors could rebuild their lives, empower themselves, and shape the future. Imagine a young survivor, perhaps in a refugee camp or in a new home, still struggling to come to terms with the trauma of the past. Yet, despite the weight of everything they've endured, they understand the importance of education. After all, education had been one of the most vital pillars of Jewish life before the war. Learning, studying, and transmitting knowledge had been central to Jewish identity for centuries. In the aftermath of the war, many survivors understood that this tradition could not die with them. Education, even amid the suffering, became an essential way for them to preserve not only their personal histories, but the broader cultural legacy of the Jewish people. One of the most profound aspects of education for survivors was the process of teaching the younger generation about the Holocaust. As survivors began to rebuild their lives, they understood the importance of ensuring that their children and grandchildren would not only remember the past but also learn from it. This was especially important because many young Jews had been born after the war, or were too young to remember the horrors firsthand. Survivors became the primary sources of knowledge about the Holocaust, sharing their personal experiences in order to educate the next generation. Whether in formal school settings in homes or through community gatherings, survivors passed on their stories and the lessons they had learned, ensuring that the legacy of the Holocaust would live on. For many survivors, educating the younger generation was also a way of processing their own trauma. By telling their stories, survivors were able to find meaning in their suffering and transform it into something that could help others. Education became a way for survivors to reclaim their voices and their agency, to assert that they were not just victims, but witnesses whose testimonies would shape the world's understanding of what had happened. In this sense, teaching about the Holocaust was an act of defiance, a refusal to let the trauma of their experiences be forgotten or ignored. The rebuilding of Jewish education also extended beyond the Holocaust itself. For survivors who had been cut off from formal schooling during the war, returning to education was a way of reasserting control over their lives. In many cases, survivors had to rebuild their own education, learning new skills and languages to adapt to their new environments. Education was often seen as a way to create new opportunities to move beyond the trauma of the past and to create a better future for themselves and their children. In this sense, education became an essential tool for self-empowerment, allowing survivors to shape their futures even when their pasts were filled with loss and suffering. But rebuilding Jewish education was not only about survivors teaching the next generation. It was also about the broader Jewish community's efforts to establish schools, institutions, and organizations that would help preserve Jewish heritage and ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust would be passed down. In Israel, for example, Jewish refugees played a key role in the establishment of educational institutions that focused not only on the history of the Jewish people, but also on the importance of remembering the Holocaust. These institutions became important centers for cultural education and memory, where survivors could share their experiences and teach others about the importance of never forgetting. Historians note that the post-war efforts to rebuild Jewish education were crucial in helping survivors and their families heal from the trauma of the Holocaust. These educational efforts didn't just teach facts, they taught resilience, identity, and the importance of community. The survivors' commitment to passing on knowledge and preserving their history became a powerful form of resistance, a way of asserting that despite everything they had lost, the Jewish people would continue to grow, to learn, and to thrive. As you reflect tonight, think about the role of education in the survivor's journey. For many, it was the key to rebuilding their lives, their identities, and their communities. Education became a way to pass on the lessons of the Holocaust, to ensure that future generations would never forget the atrocities that had been committed. It also became a way for survivors to process their trauma, to find meaning in their suffering, and to reclaim a sense of agency in a world that had tried to strip them of everything. Education was not just a tool for personal growth, it was a tool for cultural survival, a way to ensure that the legacy of the Jewish people would continue to be passed on no matter the hardships. As we continue to reflect on the survivor's journey, we must also examine one of the most powerful and enduring elements of the refugee experience: the rebuilding of Jewish communities. While much of the focus on the post-war period often centers on individual survival, the collective rebuilding of community was one of the most critical aspects of recovery for many survivors. After losing everything: homes, families, friends, and even their sense of identity, refugees were left to piece together a new life, often in foreign lands. Yet, through collective effort and solidarity, survivors came together to rebuild not just their individual lives, but the fabric of Jewish communal life itself. Imagine being one of the few survivors of your family and community. You've seen everything you knew and loved destroyed, and you feel isolated, uncertain about what the future holds. Yet, as you walk through the streets of your new home, you begin to notice something powerful a community is forming. Other refugees, people who have shared your pain, your loss, and your experience, are starting to come together. Slowly and often quietly, the pieces of your old life are being reassembled, not just in your home, but within the larger collective. This community becomes more than just a place of refuge, it becomes a source of strength, a foundation on which you can begin to rebuild your identity, your traditions, and your connection to the Jewish people. For many survivors, the rebuilding of community was not just about creating a new place to live, it was about preserving what had been lost. Jewish communal life, with its deep cultural, spiritual, and social traditions, was an essential part of their identities before the war. Rebuilding these communities meant reestablishing synagogue schools, cultural centers, and other institutions that had once formed the heart of Jewish life. Even in the face of immense loss, survivors understood that they could not let the legacy of Jewish community be destroyed. Rebuilding was an act of defiance, a way of saying to the world, "We will not be erased." In many places, survivors rebuilt their communities not only through cultural and religious institutions, but through social organizations that allowed them to support each other. These organizations helped refugees find work, housing, and social connections, often forming the backbone of the rebuilding process. By coming together, survivors were able to share resources, exchange knowledge, and offer emotional support. They helped one another cope with the trauma of the past while also creating new opportunities for a future that seemed uncertain. The collective effort to rebuild Jewish communities was a testament to the resilience of the survivors who understood that they could only fully heal by coming together and supporting one another. One of the most significant aspects of the rebuilding process was the creation of new Jewish families. For many survivors, the ability to start a family again after losing so many loved ones was an essential part of the healing process. Marriage and the birth of children were symbolic of the continuity of Jewish life, even in the face of the Holocaust. It was a way for survivors to assert their right to live, to continue, and to pass on their heritage to future generations. The next generation of Jews was seen not only as a symbol of survival, but also as the key to the future of the Jewish people. Historians often emphasize the role of Israel in the rebuilding of Jewish communities after the war. The establishment of Israel in 1948 provided a new homeland for many survivors, offering them a place where they could live in safety and security. The return to Israel, or the creation of new Jewish communities in Israel, was seen as a way to reassert the Jewish people's right to exist in the world, free from the fear of persecution. But the journey to Israel wasn't without its own challenges. Many refugees faced difficulties adjusting to life in the newly formed state, including dealing with language barriers, cultural differences, and the trauma of their past. However, Israel became a focal point for many Jewish survivors, offering them the chance to build a new life in a place where they could feel secure and connected to their heritage. As refugees resettled in various countries across the world, the idea of Jewish community remained central to their recovery. In the United States, Canada, and other countries, Jewish refugees formed tight-knit communities, often centered around synagogues and Jewish schools. These communities provided refugees with a sense of belonging and a way to reconnect with their cultural roots. The rebuilding of Jewish life in the diaspora became one of the most important ways to honor the memory of those lost during the Holocaust. The survivors knew that their survival was not just about their own lives, it was about ensuring the continuity of Jewish identity for future generations. The rebuilding of Jewish communities after the war was not just about creating new institutions or physical spaces, it was about rebuilding trust, solidarity, and a shared sense of purpose. For survivors, coming together to rebuild their communities was an act of collective healing. It was a way of saying to the world, we are still here. We are still strong. We will continue to thrive no matter what. And in this rebuilding process, survivors found the strength to not only survive the trauma of the past, but to move forward and build new lives filled with hope, community, and purpose. As you reflect tonight, think about the power of community and solidarity. In the face of unimaginable loss, survivors found strength in coming together, rebuilding their communities, and ensuring that the lessons of the Holocaust would never be forgotten. The creation of new Jewish families, the establishment of new homes, and the rebuilding of Jewish life around the world were essential steps in the survivors' journey toward healing. They demonstrated that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can rebuild, reclaim, and create something beautiful out of the ruins. As we approach the final stages of the survivors' journey, we turn to one of the most important aspects of their post-war experience, the responsibility of future generations to carry the memory forward. While the survivors themselves were the witnesses to the atrocities of the Holocaust, the burden of remembering, of ensuring that such a tragedy is never forgotten, was passed down to their children and grandchildren. This responsibility to preserve the truth of what happened and to pass it on to the world became one of the most essential tasks of the Jewish community in the post-war years. Imagine yourself as a child of a Holocaust survivor growing up in the aftermath of such profound trauma. You hear your parents speak in hushed tones about their experiences in the camps, about the loss, the suffering, and the survival, but you cannot truly understand. The horrors they speak of seem distant, abstract, a part of a history that is hard to grasp. And yet you feel the weight of the responsibility that has been placed upon you. You are the next generation, the one who must carry their stories forward. You are the one who must make sure that their memories live on even when they are gone. For the children of Holocaust survivors, this task was both sacred and heavy. On one hand, they were asked to listen, to understand, and to bear witness to the stories of their parents. On the other hand, they were tasked with ensuring that those stories would not fade with time, that the memory of the Holocaust would never be lost to history. This responsibility was not just about remembering the victims, it was about preventing history from repeating itself. It was a moral obligation to honor the lives lost and to make sure that future generations would understand the depth of the atrocities committed and the importance of standing up against hatred, intolerance, and dehumanization. Historians and educators alike emphasize the vital role that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors play in the ongoing process of remembrance. Many of the children of survivors have become the voices that carry the stories forward, sharing their parents' experiences through books, public speeches, and educational programs. They have taken on the mantle of responsibility, knowing that their efforts are crucial in making sure that the lessons of the Holocaust are passed on to the next generation. Their commitment to preserving these stories ensures that the memory of the Holocaust remains alive, that future generations will not forget the horrors that occurred, and that they will be equipped to prevent such atrocities from happening again. For many survivors, the process of passing on their stories was not just about ensuring historical accuracy, it was about making sense of their own trauma. By sharing their experiences with their children, they were able to make meaning out of the pain and loss that defined their lives. Telling their stories allowed survivors to process the grief they had carried for years, to speak the unspeakable, and to find a way to heal. But for the next generation, the act of listening and learning became a way of continuing the legacy of survival. It became a way of honoring their parents' strength and resilience, and ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be forgotten. However, for children of survivors, the emotional toll of carrying this responsibility was not always easy. Many struggled with the weight of their parents' trauma and the emotional burden of bearing witness to such unimaginable pain. Survivor families often experienced a unique kind of tension. While the children felt the deep responsibility to preserve their parents' stories, they also wrestled with their own sense of identity, knowing that their lives had been shaped by an event they had not directly experienced. This generational burden created a unique dynamic within survivor families, one that continues to affect descendants of Holocaust survivors today. The task of carrying the memory forward was both a privilege and a challenge. In the broader Jewish community, the responsibility to remember and educate about the Holocaust was institutionalized through museums, memorials, and educational programs. Institutions like Yad Vashem in Israel and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., became central in the effort to preserve the memory of the Holocaust. These institutions, along with countless others around the world, provide spaces for reflection, education, and remembrance. They ensure that the atrocities of the Holocaust are not forgotten, and that new generations of students, regardless of their background, can learn the lessons of the Holocaust and understand the importance of preventing future genocides. As you reflect tonight, think about the immense responsibility that future generations carry in preserving the memory of the Holocaust. The survivors may no longer be with us, but their stories live on through their children, grandchildren, and the global Jewish community. Their efforts to pass on the lessons of the Holocaust ensure that we will never forget the lives lost and the lessons learned. It is up to each of us to carry this responsibility forward, to honor the legacy of those who survived, and to teach the next generation about the importance of tolerance, compassion, and justice. As we near the conclusion of our journey through the post-war experiences of Jewish refugees, it's crucial to reflect on the broader impact of the Holocaust on global society and the lasting lessons that continue to shape the world today. The survivors' experiences, the trauma they endured, and the resilience they demonstrated offer vital lessons in humanity, justice, and the importance of vigilance against the forces of hatred and intolerance. The story of the Jewish refugees is not just a story of survival, it is a cautionary tale that resonates with the world at large, reminding us of the fragility of peace and the need to protect human rights for all people. Imagine for a moment looking beyond the personal stories of survival to the global context. The Holocaust was not just a tragedy for the Jewish people, it was a tragedy for all of humanity. It was a stark reminder of what can happen when unchecked hatred, racism, and authoritarianism are allowed to flourish. The Holocaust is a deeply painful chapter in history, but it is also a defining moment that underscores the importance of standing up against injustice wherever it occurs. Survivors, through their testimonies, their communities, and their efforts to rebuild, made it clear that the lessons of the Holocaust must not be forgotten. The tragedy they lived through calls for collective responsibility to ensure that future generations learn from the past, so that history is never repeated. The aftermath of the war and the subsequent efforts to rebuild Jewish communities also set the stage for a greater global awareness of human rights. The horrors of the Holocaust prompted the international community to take concrete steps toward protecting individuals and ensuring that the atrocities committed by the Nazis would never happen again. One of the most significant outcomes of the Holocaust was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. This declaration, which set out fundamental human rights to be universally protected, was in part a response to the atrocities of the war. It was a recognition that the dignity and worth of every human being must be upheld, regardless of race, religion, or nationality. Historians and human rights advocates often point to the Holocaust as the catalyst for the creation of international laws and institutions designed to prevent genocide and protect human rights. In the years following the war, the international community established conventions on refugees, the prosecution of war criminals, and the prevention of future genocides. The lessons learned from the Holocaust shaped the foundations of modern human rights law and provided the impetus for the creation of global institutions such as the International Criminal Court. These efforts, while far from perfect, have been essential in the ongoing fight to prevent mass atrocities and protect vulnerable populations around the world. The survivors in their quest for justice and remembrance have contributed to a global culture of awareness. They have shown the world the cost of indifference, the dangers of allowing prejudice to fester, and the importance of speaking out against hatred. Their voices, though often burdened with the weight of the past, have become instruments of change. Through their testimonies, through their advocacy, and through the institutions they helped create, they have ensured that the lessons of the Holocaust are passed down to future generations. These survivors have become not just witnesses to history, but guardians of its lessons, ensuring that the world remembers the horrors of the Holocaust in order to prevent future atrocities. Tonight, as you reflect on the lasting impact of the Holocaust, think about the responsibility we all share in carrying forward the lessons learned. The survivors of the Holocaust have shown us the depth of human resilience, the power of memory, and the importance of standing against injustice. Their journey of survival, rebuilding, and remembrance is not just a part of Jewish history, it is part of world history. And it is a reminder that we must all work to create a world where such atrocities can never be repeated. The world that survivors rebuilt was not just for themselves, it was for all of humanity as a collective effort to ensure that we never forget the price of hatred and the value of human dignity. As we come to the final chapter of our journey through the lives of Jewish refugees after World War, it is important to reflect on the enduring legacy of their survival and how their stories continue to shape the world we live in today. The Holocaust, with all its unspeakable horrors, left an indelible mark on the survivors, on the Jewish people, and on humanity as a whole. Yet the survivors' ability to rebuild their lives, preserve their identity, and pass on their stories to future generations stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their legacy is not only one of survival, it is one of defiance of strength and of a commitment to ensuring that such horrors are never repeated. Imagine for a moment the survivors, now older, looking back on their journey. They have lived through the unimaginable and have rebuilt their lives in new lands. They've shared their stories, fought for justice, and preserved their cultural identity for future generations. Now, in their later years, they reflect on the world that has changed so much since the war. The stories they have passed down have influenced the world in ways they could never have fully anticipated. The Holocaust has become a central point in global discussions about human rights justice and the importance of remembering history so that it is never repeated. The survivors, through their endurance and their voices, have helped shape a world that, though flawed, is more aware of the dangers of intolerance and hatred. The post-Holocaust period also saw the emergence of Holocaust education as an essential part of global curricula. Museums, memorials, and educational programs dedicated to preserving the memory of the Holocaust have become integral to ensuring that future generations understand the atrocities that occurred and the importance of preventing such crimes from happening again. The survivors' testimonies collected over decades have become the foundation of this education. They are not just a means of remembering, they are a means of teaching empathy, understanding, and responsibility. The survivors' willingness to share their painful experiences ensures that we, as a global community, can learn from the past and continue to build a future rooted in justice and peace. One of the most remarkable aspects of the survivors' legacy is the way their stories continue to inspire future generations. The children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors carry with them the lessons of the past, even if they were not directly affected by the horrors of the camps. For them, the Holocaust is not just a historical event, it is a personal responsibility to carry the memory forward and ensure that it is never forgotten. The survivors' children have become advocates for justice, human rights, and education, taking the lessons learned from their parents and applying them to their own lives and work. The legacy of survival and remembrance continues to shape the values of communities around the world. In addition to the profound impact on the Jewish community, the legacy of Holocaust survivors has also contributed to broader global movements for human rights and social justice. The survivors' refusal to let their suffering be forgotten has inspired countless efforts to combat discrimination, bigotry, and violence around the world. Their commitment to ensuring that the atrocities of the Holocaust are never repeated has become a rallying cry for those working to prevent genocide and protect vulnerable populations. The Holocaust serves as a stark reminder that human rights must be defended for all people, and the survivors' voices remain at the heart of these global efforts. As you reflect tonight, consider the incredible strength of these survivors and the enduring impact of their journey. From the devastation of the camps to the rebuilding of their lives, they demonstrated the power of the human spirit to endure, to resist, and to rebuild. Their stories are not just personal accounts of survival, they are a call to action, urging us all to be vigilant against hate, to stand up for justice, and to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are passed down for generations to come. The survivor's legacy is one of hope in the face of despair, of strength in the face of destruction, and of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. As we carry their memory forward, we must never forget that the price of peace and freedom is eternal vigilance. The survivors have given us the tools to understand the depths of human suffering, but also the power of resistance, solidarity, and remembrance. It is now up to us to ensure that their legacy endures, that we continue to educate, to fight for justice, and to uphold the values of dignity, tolerance, and human rights for all people. Sweet dreams.